Good afternoon, and welcome to the 7th annual Rare Disease Day event here at the Broad. I'm very excited this year, and I know we have a lot of people online and some people in the audience to host this hybrid event to commemorate Rare Disease Day, which is an international event happening all around the world yesterday and today. But this year, as a special treat, we are co-hosting the event with the Termeer Foundation. My name is Greka. I'm a physician scientist at the Brigham, associate professor at Harvard Medical School, and an institute member here at the Broad Institute. And it really is my honor and pleasure to host this event today and serve as your MC. Before I introduce you to my co-host, Belinda Termeer, I wanted to make a couple of comments about this event and share some thoughts with you. So actually, the first thing that I wanted to say as we are opening up our Rare Disease Day event today is actually to remind us of some words that I found yesterday of one of my personal heroes, Marie Curie. She said, we share a general responsibility for all humanity, a particular duty being to aid those to whom we think we can be most helpful. She wasn't only once, but twice a Nobel laureate. And she took her own message to heart when in 1914, she actually left her lab behind and used her knowledge of science, and specifically X-rays, to help save lives in World War I. Why am I reminding us of a celebrated scientist and her work during a war? Well, because I think that today we would be remiss if we didn't mention that, all of us, physicians, scientists, patients, and advocates, I think we're all keenly aware, maybe glued to our TVs and phones for the day, on the ugliness of the war and destruction that's taking place in Ukraine right now. And I think we all want to add our voices to a call for peace for all of those in need. And like you, of course, as a physician and a scientist, I'm horrified about this immense and senseless loss of life. My mission, as all of us here, is to preserve and protect life. And so nothing could be more antithetical to that than war, of course. And I'm also thinking today of all those patients, sick people in hospitals in such war-torn areas, and people with rare diseases, and how it must be even harder for them to try to survive under these chaotic circumstances. Another thing that's important to mention is that Ukraine has a lot of scientists. They have a very strong chemistry presence, in fact, that serves as CROs for a lot of the Boston biotechnology ecosystem. And I know that many of our colleagues in the biotech space know of colleagues in Ukraine who are right now, their livelihoods and lives have been upended. So it's just, senseless conflict. So what can we do? I just want to say from this podium today that I think it's important to add our voices to all these other countless voices around the world who are calling for peace, and to send a clear message that the rare disease community is calling for peace today. Coming back to Rare Disease Day, I do want to share with you the story of how this event came to be here at the Broad, and some personal reflections on where we are, what we have accomplished, and where we are today. So I first joined the Broad about 7 years ago, and I was drawn to this amazing institution, one of the premier genomic institutions in the world, because I felt that this would be a place where my team and I could really do what we do best, which is to basically decipher the underlying mechanisms of rare diseases and then try to build sort of bespoke, targeted ways to fix them, to treat the problem. In the decade that has passed since I started my lab, and in the last 7 years that I've been here at the Broad, I'm pleased to say that, in fact, this has been a very fertile ground for the work that we do. And we have been able to advance 2 of our discoveries toward patients in the clinic. And actually, it was serendipitous and an antithesis to the bad news that are out there this morning, that I learned in the news that the first scientific discovery out of my lab that made it into the clinic, they just announced today that it was actually successful in phase 2 trials. So that's just remarkable news for any scientist. Oh, thank you. This is really a testament to the team in the lab and the amazing environment that we've had here to make this science thrive. But I think the best news is for patients suffering, in this case, from a rare kidney disease called FSGS. So there's definitely more work to be done, and we're definitely on it. But you can see that inspired by my own work in rare diseases, I thought, what could be a more perfect place to host a special celebration for rare diseases than the Broad? And I was just delighted, and not surprised, but delighted that our current director, Todd Golub, who was our CSO at the time, was completely in support of the plan. And he just said, Anna, that's great, just run with it. So I've owned this event for the last 7 years since I had this idea, and Todd has been incredibly supportive, and I'm very glad for that. And you know, I really do think that the Broad is at the forefront of this genomic revolution, and we have so much to contribute and so much more to do in this rare disease space. I'll remind you that out of about 7,000 rare diseases, about 80% of them are caused by genetic defects, and there's a lot of other mechanisms that cause the remainder. We will be talking about some of that today, thinking about rare cancers. But over the years, you know, the last few years, we have featured Mila's Miracle and Batten disease with Julia Vitarello, Mila's mom, telling us her amazing story of a patient turned scientific partner and advocate. She's well known to this community. We featured NGLY1 deficiency and Matt Might, telling us the story of how the illness in his son Bertrand caused him to become a parent who has become a scientist. We have featured many patients with many different genetically driven and otherwise rare diseases. We have featured our own David Liu, who's now pioneering discoveries in base and prime editing that can one day provide sort of bespoke cures for these rare diseases. We featured the CZI's Rare as One initiative, which aims to really support patient organizations and advocacy organizations for rare diseases. And close to my heart, we have also featured the Rare Kidney Disease Foundation and Richard Nelson, who started that foundation, who shared his family's ordeal with finding a diagnosis for their rare disease. And so, much to the spirit of bringing highlights of science and bridging that to patients and patient voices, that's the theme for our event today as well, focused on rare cancers. And so, Belinda will tell you more about our agenda on rare cancers. Just one final note, you may have seen the beautiful portrait that we have on the flyer for this event, and also there's a collection of other portraits in the lobby. There's a story behind that as well. 7 years ago, I was walking down a hallway at Harvard Medical School, and I saw these beautiful portraits of kids with rare diseases, and that's how I met Patty Welton, who is the CEO of Beyond the Diagnosis. This is an organization that aims to use art as a way to raise awareness for rare diseases, and they have had incredible impact over the past many years, and we have consistently hosted Beyond the Diagnosis portraits for Rare Disease Day at the Broad for the last 7 years, which is, again, a wonderful partnership and collaboration with Patty and her organization. And so without further ado, let me now introduce you to our newest partner in this journey in the rare disease space, and that's the Termeer Foundation, and of course, Belinda Termeer. She's the founder of the Termeer Foundation, whose mission is to identify and empower people who can bring life-changing treatments to patients, building on the legacy of what we all know to be a true pioneer in the rare disease space, Henry Termeer. So, Belinda, thank you so much for your partnership, and please take it away.
Thank you, Anna, for your kind introduction, and thank you for your comments about Ukraine. Hello, everyone. As Anna said, I am Belinda Termeer, the president and co-founder of the Termeer Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you to the inaugural Rare Disease Day event brought to you by the Broad Institute and the Termeer Foundation. And we're delighted to have this opportunity to partner with the Broad on today's Spotlight on Cancer. I also want to thank the Broad team led by Drs. Anna Greka and Jillian Shaw for putting together such a distinct agenda that showcases cancer research and therapeutics taking place across our life science ecosystem. We are excited to hear about advancements from leaders at the Broad, Theonis, Dana-Farber, Breakthrough Cancer, and the Termeer Center for Targeted Therapies at the Mass General Brigham Hospital. We also are privileged to hear 3 powerful patient stories from individuals who have lived through the challenges of a rare cancer diagnosis. When my husband, Henry Termeer, decided to dedicate his career to finding treatments for patients afflicted with rare and ultra-rare diseases, his ideas were not universally embraced by our industry. Henry felt that if you focus on the patient and understand their needs, everything else will follow and fall into place. Fast forward 30 years, and we now can see scores of biopharmaceutical companies in Cambridge and beyond who are dedicating R&D resources to developing treatments for rare disease patients worldwide. On the vanguard of the rare disease research is the Broad Institute, where hundreds of scientists work tirelessly on scientific programs that one day will be used to treat patients and hopefully save lives. We will hear today about some of that work that has taken place within these labs and the hope it brings to those living with rare cancers. Again, thank you all for joining us. And to get us started with today's program is a fireside chat between Adam Hayden, who is a patient advocate and Broad member with the National Brain Tumor Society, and Drew Joseph, a reporter with Stat News. Welcome, Adam and Drew.
We can't hear you as yet. Let's see. We'll give it a moment.
Can you hear?
Yes,
Can you hear
perfect. Perfect.
All right, there we go. Okay, hi, I'm Drew. I'm a reporter at Stat. Thanks everyone who's attending, and thanks very much to the organizers for putting this on. It's a real treat to be here with my friend Adam. I'm gonna have Adam tell you a little bit about himself in a second, but just a bit of our backstory. So Adam, as he'll tell you, was diagnosed with glioblastoma, I think 5 or 6 years ago now at this point, and entered into the patient advocacy world. And that's how I got to know him. And 2018, I wrote a profile about him and his family and got to spend a few days with them in the Indianapolis area where they live. So, and we've stayed in touch ever since. So that's what we'll be talking about a bit about today. And Adam is going to be participating in the Q&A later on, but if you have questions that you really want to ask right away, that's great. And the Broad people will kindly relay those to us as well. So Adam, to start, if you don't mind just telling us a bit about yourself and then your experience as a person with a rare disease or rare cancer.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Drew, for participating in this chat with me. When Drew says that he spent some time with our family, he means that, really immersed himself in our family. We've got 3 young kiddos. So Drew was all in, I guess is the sort of gonzo journalist style. Got embedded with 3 young boys and my wife and I here in Indianapolis. So we are indebted to Drew's incredible profile that is a piece that we cherish in our family. So, hey, I am Adam, living with glioblastoma since June of 2016. So Drew was right, 5 or 6 years. We are in that place. I am an exceptional responder, meaning that, man, I have lived longer than they told me I was supposed to. So it's an interesting place to live, both with a rare disease, but then also to have much more time of survivorship than folks with this disease have. So it's kind of 2 different hats, I suppose, the rare disease hat and then the long-term survivorship hat. I was diagnosed at 34 years old. My youngest was only 8 months old at the time, the youngest of our 3 boys. And we wondered at the time, would Dad even have memories or would Gideon rather have memories of his dad? And thankfully, I get to walk him to the school bus each morning now with his 2 older brothers and send them off to elementary school. So that time that I've had with my family, that we've had together, the time that we didn't expect has brought all sorts of course, as you would imagine, times of joy, times of celebration, but also times of vulnerability and times to realize that when you're living with a rare cancer or any rare disease, that there's a social impact, that sometimes it can feel as though the medical community sort of doesn't know what to do with you. So while we are so happy to celebrate this long-term survivorship, I think the reality of living with a rare disease is that, gosh, how do you go on living like this? My wife said to me at my 4-year anniversary, I don't know how we live another 4 years like this. And that's not because she's pessimistic or is cynical, but rather because this is such a difficult journey. And as we're finding in the rare disease community and in this long-term cancer survivorship community, we don't always provide the resources and the tools to support patients like me and families like ours. So that's a big piece of my advocacy. So maybe I'll leave that long-winded introduction there, Drew, and look to you for the next prompt. Where do I go from here?
I mean, you kind of were hitting on a topic I was about to ask about, in that, like, not only do you have this rare disease, but you have quite a rare experience with this disease, because, kind of to put it crudely, like, you're still alive. And I guess, like, Can you tell us a little bit more about maybe ways that the health system doesn't really isn't maybe designed or doesn't know like how to best care for you or provide support for you? Because I think when you got first diagnosed, it was surgery, chemo, radiation, like very clear. And then it's been years since then of surveillance, but what else could I don't know, the providers be doing for you, or what else could the system be doing for you and your family as well?
Yeah, terrific. Good. And I do think, this is something that I've tried to emphasize is that, when we expose opportunities within the system, right, within the healthcare community writ large, that I really do think that patients and clinicians are sort of bound together. And I think that the dynamic between patients and those who provide healing, that there's solidarity to be found there. And so I think we can be critical of the systems at times while really uplifting our clinicians who have done so much just acutely right through the pandemic, but who are brought to their careers because they want to provide healing. So anytime I say critical remarks, it's always important for me to qualify, gosh, that I am all in with solidarity between patients and providers. That relationship is really a relationship that is of sacred and holy trust, right? Between a therapeutic partnership that we are all members of this care team to provide the best quality of life that we can. But it's on sort of that quality of life fulcrum, I think, that the long-term survivorship experience turns. So we do have these protocols, these standard of care protocols. And within the glioblastoma space, which is the cancer that I have, the standard of care protocol is 6 months. And so 6 months, gosh, that's 6 months of what we know, what we're doing. But then you get further and further out from that, like you said, that time of surveillance. And then we find that those long-term protocols just aren't quite where we need them to be. I think care coordination is so important that we oftentimes at the point of diagnosis, it's all focused about here is that standard of care, the cancer treatment that you're going to get today, right, in the near term. But we don't set us up for that care coordination across multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary teams. So connecting with social workers, with chaplains, with behavioral health or mental health professionals, to see that all as one kind of comprehensive package that we provide to folks early on, as close to the point of diagnosis as possible, and that can provide support through a patient's journey. I think that's what I'm trying to advocate for these days, is to have sort of more forward-thinking survivorship plans, because it's a good problem to have, but we are seeing more and more long-term cancer survivors. So as the science gets better on the front end, which the folks at Broad are just contributing volumes to that work, I'm so appreciative. My friend Corey Painter is so wonderful. You'll hear from her later. I was on the Count Me In iteration for brain cancer, the Brain Cancer Project. I was fortunate to be an advisory committee member for that project. So hats off to the Broad. But as we get better at creating long-term survivors, we need to make sure that we also keep those long-term survivors in mind as we plan the protocols of the future.
So is that something you've kind of had to build for yourself, like figuring out that actually you all could use some social support, or actually you all could use some mental health support at times? Like, is that kind of something you've had to pick up providers where you need them, or kind of build your own team instead of having like a health system being like, and these are all the services we think you might potentially need?
Yeah. So, I like this kind of menu of options, that you might build your own plan. I think that there's a lot of insight there to be gleaned by just the way that you framed that question. I happen to be somebody who, I've said that I'm well suited for illness, which is kind of a funny thing to say. I, in fact, was studying philosophy. My graduate degree is in philosophy, and I was studying medical ethics long before I was diagnosed. So it's interesting because I bring to this patient experience this sort of background education around like medical ethics and medical humanities, things like that. So I think, for my wife and I, my wife, Whitney, who's just a champion and an advocate and has 14-ish years working in a level 1 trauma center in our county hospital here. Whitney is awesome. But, without my education and sort of medical ethics, without having a spouse who is a full-time healthcare professional, it's that combination that has allowed us to be proactive and to identify those services. But I think so often about newly diagnosed patients who are just overwhelmed at the sheer magnitude of the diagnosis, that don't know how to put those tools in place to get that sort of wraparound support. So yeah, it is something that I think we've had to build, and thankfully have been equipped with some of the tools to build that. So I think it's important for me to share that the lessons there to help newly diagnosed patients understand they can tap into resources more than just chemo and radiation, for sure.
I mean, I can attest that Whitney is indeed amazing. And so, just like briefly, like I wonder, it might be helpful for us to understand a little bit about what your, I guess, treatment and surveillance like is like these days, being in, someone who went through that primary sort of 6 months, like you were saying, but then is now sort of hasn't had a recurrence and is in this sort of long-term survivorship period. So I know you get scans every so often, and then you're on medication for like symptom control. But can you tell us a little bit about that and sort of what you have to do every day or every few months to kind of keep up with your illness?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think this is the reality that really there's a sort of social impact of living with this rare disease. So there are actions and decisions and choices that Whitney and I face, yes, regularly, if not daily. But then there's also sort of the broader social landscape of living with something. It can be pretty isolating when other folks don't know that experience. I mean, in fact, just yesterday morning, I had a partial seizure. So this is like one of my stubborn symptoms that I just can't seem to get rid of. Really well controlled with medication, but we're sort of at that ceiling where a little bit more of this med may mean fewer seizures, but I'm a little bit more of a walking zombie, right? So trying to figure that out. So that just highlights the importance of a therapeutic partnership with your clinician, so you can have those conversations and build that trust. But for example, there was a meeting that I had yesterday afternoon where I needed to lead a part of that meeting. And I just had a really rough morning. And I could tell that I was fatigued, that I wasn't thinking as sharply as I usually do, a lot of weakness on one side of my body. This is all related to the location of my brain tumor, my brain cancer. And so I had to text that meeting organizer and say, listen, this is a hard thing to explain, but I'm in bad shape. And so I will join this meeting and do the thing I got to do, but then I got to drop from it. So having to send that message just amplifies. That's a kind of a lonely experience because folks don't know what to connect that to. So there is an everyday impact. You mentioned these scans, and there's a great term right within the cancer community. There's anxiety related to scans, and you put it together, and it's scanxiety, and that is a thing. I mean, this is funny because I didn't plan to share this, but Whitney just texted me this morning and said your next MRI is in a month. So that it is always on our mind, which is another interesting thing. I mean, I think people think, gosh, Adam, you're this patient advocate. Sort of all you talk about and all you write about is patient advocacy and having cancer. And, maybe that makes me sound like, I don't know, I'm in that rut or something. But it is something that we live with each and every day. And I think it's the rare disease community where we find each other. So for us, it isn't abnormal to have disease discussions, right? It's in the reference of the general population. Why are these people always talking about end of life and palliative care and being ill? Isn't that such a downer? But I think when you turn inward to your community, certainly the brain tumor community is this for me, you have a family where it is normalized to have open conversations about how you're doing. So I think that's also part of me wanting to tell my story in the world is to normalize those difficult conversations. So I can send a text to a meeting organizer and be like, here's what's up. I'm not going to be able to attend the full meeting. And that isn't a strange one-off, but that is we've created an environment where that is okay and that is accepted and we understand. I think that's where we need to move to long term.
So, I mean, you kind of talked about your advocacy work. I mean, obviously, in things like Rare Disease Day are the result of people with rare diseases really being sort of forceful advocates for themselves and sort of finding, I guess, across like if one individual rare disease can't maybe get that much attention, but like everyone recognizing that a lot of people collectively have rare diseases can be quite impactful. You and I have spoken a good amount over the years about the demands of advocacy on you and your family and sort of like trying to strike this balance just between obviously wanting to get involved, but not becoming like some mascot. This is the only thing you do and preserving who you were and your family life. But because this is rare disease, there aren't a ton of people to do it. And so you kind of have this, in kind of like what you're talking about, you have this patient experience where, in a month you have to get an MRI, but you're also talking about the bigger picture at events like this and, being a representative. So I'm not sure if you would call that like having like dual roles or something like that, but like, how does that having your personal experience and then this representative experience sort of weigh on you and your family and like, I don't know, like affect your burden with this disease?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's good. So I think I think I want to respond in a couple of ways. I think there's a paradox within sort of the rare disease community as we've classified that, is that when you look to other communities that are organized around, and I mean everything from a soccer fan supporters group. I mean, I don't mean only within the healthcare space, but oftentimes, we create these groups, we taxonomize around folks having some things in common. But within the rare disease community, we're classified together sort of as a premise because we don't have anything in common with anybody else, so it's a funny paradoxical group of folks. So, when the rare disease community connects, or when people with rare diseases connect, it's almost in the space of like, let's find what we have in common is how little we can relate to other people. So there is that sort of paradoxical living. So I think maybe that's just the first thing to comment on, which is just an interesting sort of group of people. When we think about carving nature at the joints, does it make sense to put people together only because they sort of have this rare thing? I think it's something worth talking about. I'm not, that's very just hand wavy of me to say that, but that's one thing that I felt like was maybe worth saying right now. I think the other thing about the sort of the mascot, the advocate, right? But then also what is your personal life and the things that are important to you. I think something that I've realized that I'm trying to be really mindful of. And I think it's a necessary coping mechanism. And I would hope that this resonates with other patient advocates. But I think you begin to create an identity of yourself that is that patient advocate. There's some good work in psychiatry around narrative identity, that maybe the ways that we work out our personal identities is by the stories we tell about ourselves. That's a really attractive view to me. And I think that there's sort of the narrative or the advocate Adam that is built on who I am and is built on the experiences that I go through. But I think just because to protect me from the pain, right, of living, it's tough. I mean, I'm living with this thing, and wonderful that I've lived this long, but an abbreviated life is likely on the horizon. So, I've got to protect myself and my family from just revisiting that pain over and over and over. So I think as somebody who is a vocal patient advocate, that then there's sort of this advocate character who goes up and takes the stage. And there's a sense of that person is related to me in important ways, but isn't me. Because to be fully vulnerable and to do that all the time is so taxing, as you kind of alluded to in your question. That rawness of sort of revisiting the scene of the crime over and over every time you do an advocacy event. I think that's why mental health is so important within the advocate community. And I think also, I was involved with a really cool project not too long ago called Convening the Center, which is a really neat, Dana Lewis, who maybe some people know is a patient advocate person. But during that group, something that we talked about, this brought together, 30 or so of kind of well-known patient advocates just within the contemporary healthcare space. One of the things that we talked about is the importance of sort of signaling when you need a break, that is enough. And I think, in the world of work, right, there's this sort of capitalist notion that like, man, you got to grind and grind and grind. And that's how you get ahead. And I think sometimes it's easy for patient advocates to feel like, oh, I gave this talk and it opened this door, and then I had this meeting, and then I joined this committee. And while there's a sense that expands our ability to uplift our community, there's also the reality that grind culture is really tough on folks like me and other rare diseases, where that fatigue is cumulative and will cause other symptoms and side effects. So balancing being in the world with protecting yourself or your family. My wife said one time, you're giving your very best to the world and you're just giving the rest to us back at home. And so she helped to kind of rebalance my priorities, because it's about being here, present with my kids, with my family, not necessarily at the Broad Auditorium every single day, right? So that's part of the balancing act for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's what you've been working on, I know, for a long time. I mean, so just one thing that you do, though, in terms of that work, though, is you're a board member of the National Brain Tumor Society, I believe. And I think you all just launched, maybe even this month, correct me if I'm wrong, sort of a new research endeavor called the DNA Damage Response Consortium. Can you tell us like a bit about that? And I guess also specifically like what we know, a big research consortium, like what is your role and what do you want your role to be as a patient? Tell us about that.
Yeah, great, good. So I am a board member with National Brain Tumor Society, honored to be so. It's a cool, there's like the rules of nonprofit is like give money, get money, or go. And like I'm sort of a middle class suburban dude in Indianapolis. So I'm honored to be a member of that board. Anyway, that might be nonprofit humor for if anybody's watching in that space. So yeah, I think this DNA Damage Response Consortium, what I love about National Brain Tumor Society, I mean, long before any board membership or things like that, I was drawn to this organization because it's important to us, it's important to NBTS to fund collaborative research, not only to sort of give the money to one PI in one lab in one institution, but to create research collaboratives that bring multiple people together. I think this DNA Damage Response Consortium is just like that, bringing together top researchers, top clinicians, top institutions, DNA damage response. So what are we even talking about? Well, I mean, I guess I'm speaking to the broad, so I don't need to define it too much. But, in precision medicine, where we've been pursuing, these druggable targets for a long time, which is important work and work that will and should continue. DNA damage response is exploiting or seeks to exploit another vulnerability within malignant cells. That malignant cells have in common some dysfunction in those cells' ability to repair DNA, like double strand breaks, for example. When DNA is harmed, our cells are often good at putting them back together. But in malignant cells, we see that there's a vulnerability where there's some dysfunction around those mechanisms. So unlike a traditional precision medicine pathway where we're seeking druggable targets and developing small molecules around that, in the DNA Damage Response Consortium, it's trying to exploit this larger sort of generalized dysfunction within malignant cells to produce maybe a new class of therapeutics. We're seeing some success in ovarian and breast cancer settings, and we're hoping to find the same success within brain tumor, that we can harness these DNA damage response vulnerabilities to more effectively treat brain tumors. It is a brand new consortium that just launched. I was checking my phone. It just launched, I think, on the 22nd of this month. So you are no surprise that the journalist has got the current and up-to-date info, but absolutely, yes. So thanks for letting me speak to that for just a moment. No, you asked about sort of the patient, what am I doing? Wrapped up in all of this. I have always been one who I want to be in the science. And I know that I don't have the credentialing to get myself as deeply immersed as the folks who are actually doing the work. But it really, for me, for the past 5 years, I've read had a lab result in one hand and a medical dictionary in the other. It's been important to me. And each advocate is drawn to their own unique sets of abilities. Some advocates are terrific at meeting with elected officials. Some advocates are terrific at organizing local fundraising events. One thing that I try to be really good at is to sort of digest the science and then to share that with my patient advocate peers in a way that is approachable and that we can sort of understand. And so as a patient advocate, I think for me, it's about being a research advocate, having the knowledge to be at least conversationally competent with some of these cancer biology terms so that I can come to a research meeting and not feel overwhelmed and sort of have the confidence to contribute, as a patient, but a patient who has some competency around cancer biology.
Got it. So you have a blog, and maybe just last week you wrote something that caught my eye because I think it sort of laid bare a lot of what seemed like some pretty deep-seated frustrations from some of your experience, if you don't mind me asking. And so you write, quote, the healthcare system strips patients of their personhood and observes the body with a clinical gaze that pays no mind to our identities and certainly not our distress. In fleeting moments of restorative justice, amidst toning alarms and proning patients, a healer catches your eyes and theirs, and you are seen. But mostly it's wristbands and gowns, murmurs outside your inpatient door, and rounding physicians so busy they carried their sealed Tupperware lunches into the room to take a look at your incision. And you add, we can learn so much from patients without even meeting them, parentheses us. But to know a disease is not to know the person who has it. And we're rich on data, but short on humanity. So I'm guessing the audience, there might be a lot of researchers who rely on patient data or clinicians who treat patients, but are also using their data for research as well. And so I guess I just wanted to ask you with them as your audience, like what would you want them to know? What can they do or shouldn't they do to engage you, to get you on board, to sort of justify their using of your data, your information, your samples?
Yeah, great. Thanks. It always makes me nervous when somebody says, I read this in your blog and I'm going to quote you. I think, oh no, what did I write? That was a recent enough one that it was kind of top of mind. So I think, I'll reiterate something I said earlier, that I think even in times of criticism, it's criticism of love, right? That we can uplift the folks doing the work, whether that's at the bench or at the bedside. We can have so much appreciation for those folks while also criticizing pieces of the system that may need reforming, revision, jettisoning, whatever. So I'll just come back to that point because certainly without clinician researchers, we wouldn't even have the chemotherapy that's kept me alive this long. So it's with great appreciation. I think, oftentimes we can cleave apart the sort of research experience from the clinical experience. But I think from the patient's perspective, we don't always understand that those are different things. For us, it feels like this is medicine. So understanding the perspective of the patient, I think within, research communities, oftentimes it's like, well, here's the science, we're going to publish that science. And then this sounds a little cynical, but I think we can sort of, throw that over the wall, right? And then somebody is going to take that basic science and they're going to do the translational workup. And then that translational stuff will go into human trials. And then ultimately, there's going to be a clinician somewhere using their expert judgment to determine, is this the right treatment? Is this the right dosing? Those types of things. That's a continuum involving multiple stakeholders. But to patients like me, that feels like, well, that's just medicine. So, I think being mindful on the research side of knowing that whatever somebody's going to do with your stuff later in the workflow, that is still going to have your DNA and fingerprints on it. And I think for right and for wrong, I think really it's an opportunity for researchers to feel the value of their work in very deeply human ways, to know that thing that you did in a petri dish ultimately is a brain penetrant molecule that help beat the malignant cells in my brain. So there's a real humanizing project, I think, on the research side to understand that doesn't only happen in the lab, but it is going to benefit folks like me. So that's a positive way, I think, to talk about that. But I think there's also some potential for dehumanizing that happens all along the way, because when we do research, it's important to get some standardized protocols, right? We've got a Victor Montori, who's got a new book recently out, but the book, Why We Revolt, Victor Montori says, that there is this desire to treat patients like this rather than treating this patient. I think that's such a helpful quote from Dr. Montori that reminds us that while we do need some standardized protocols, we need a way to sort of identify the patients who will benefit most from certain therapeutics, that sort of patient stratification. Those are really important tools. But when we do that, sometimes we get a set of data rather than a group of people. So always reminding that each data point is a dad and a husband, a friend, a brother. Just having that in mind is important. And I think for the patients, to have compassion for the system. I think sometimes we do get frustrated. You saw that in what you sort of quoted from my blog, that we do get frustrated because if the first thing that I do, and even for MRI scans, right, the first thing that happens is anything that I walked in with that day gets put in a locker and I'm put in scrubs or a gown. Now, there's a reason that we do that, and I get it, but it also takes away anything that is like what you may know about me. I mean, you could look around my room, right, and you're maybe gleaning things about Adam the person because you're seeing like personal artifacts that are around. And so in the clinical setting, there's certain artifacts of my dress, right, that I'm going to have on that's going to allow you to make some, even if they're assumptions, right, to feel like you know who I am on some level. And if all of a sudden you're just a gown and put in a machine for a standard protocol, we just have to understand how dehumanizing that is. And it's exactly the same for doctors because, and this is great work to come out of the narrative medicine space. Rita Sharon is somebody who I think a lot of folks know at Columbia, who leads the program there. But she's made a great point to say medical school teaches doctors that what is beneath their white coats is irrelevant to the practice of medicine. So they've sort of, taken apart physicianhood from physicality. And so I think we're seeing that both on the patient side and the clinician side, where it's like, we're just interested in your body, but not sort of who the person or thing is that inhabits that body. And I think that's something that we can get better about as technology enhances and we can offload some of that technical stuff, we can get back to humanity, I think is important.
I think you mentioned this a bit earlier, but sort of like finding that rare disease community. And like, I think that's kind of universal in a lot of disease advocacy, whether it's rare or not, but like, and I know like you between the National Brain Tumor Society, or you all have done like in the pre-pandemic days, like gone to Congress and like done lobbying and things like that. But I guess like I also know that means that you've become close with a lot of people who have your disease and then over the ensuing years have died, because that's just the course of this illness. And like, I guess if like, speaking of that, like back to that dual burden of individual experience and being a representative, and kind of you saying how you kind of like put on your advocacy hat sometimes and sort of like leave the individual experience behind a little bit, like, and try to maybe like maintain some distance. Like I imagine that's very hard when someone from the advocacy world dies from this illness that you have. And like, I don't even know exactly what my question is, but it's just like, I like how, when something like that happens, which I know from talking with you has happened a number of times over the years, like, how does that affect your individual experience? But then also like, how, like, do you sometimes want to just like remove yourself from the advocacy world? Because it's like such a, I don't know, like a witness into like an image of what happens in your disease sometimes too.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are experiences that would surprise a lot of folks. I mean, I'm on a team of folks who facilitate a monthly brain tumor chat, hashtag BTSM. So shout out if any BTSMers are watching. And so this is the reality, is that there have been times when folks who have been regular participants in that monthly chat, if we miss them for a month and then maybe miss them the next month, then there's a group thread of us organizers, and we like take to social media to try to find clues whether we've lost that person. And so I think we're part of our advocacy is in fact to inform people that, within your end of life planning, make a plan around social media so that somebody can share a post. But that is such a unique experience that I think a lot of people just don't imagine, right, on the outside of communities like this, that we're scouring the internet to find out if one of our friends died. It's such a unique and strange experience that I think would be surprising to a lot of folks. I feel here, so I mean, vulnerability, I mean, I feel my tears sort of right on the surface here, but Drew, we are one of our close friends is in end of life care in the hospital now today. I mean, where Whitney at work has communicated with her boss that she could leave at any moment if her friend passes, or she has the opportunity to see her, which she has a couple of times. So that is, it's weird because in the brain tumor, I mean, a lot of people that get rare diseases, as time goes on, will begin to say things like, well, is this really rare? Because you start to know a lot of people who have it. And I think that the rare disease community, because we're looking for those points of connection, that we seek out each other through advocacy events and through nonprofit groups. And, in Indianapolis, I know a lot of people that have brain tumors here. We're a smaller city, right? Like 1 million people in the surrounding metro areas. And yet I've got like recent text history with, tens, maybe 20s of people who have brain tumors in the city. So it's a rare experience, but it brings us closer. And bringing us closer is that support when you need it. But exactly like you said, it also means that there's going to be an inevitable completion of that relationship when you've got a grim prognosis like brain cancer. So it is. There's two things at work, right? You need the support, but that support comes with the condition that you could be seeing someone through the completion of their lives.
Well, I mean, as always, I so appreciate you being willing to like answer my questions about that stuff. You're always such an incredible sport and so thoughtful about it. And about everything with your experience. And so we really thank you for your time and candor and all the work that you do. And I think now I'm going to pass it back to the people at the Broad for the next session.
Thanks, Drew.
Thank you both so much. Adam, this was an incredible session. Your authenticity is really humbling, and your bravery as well. So thank you so much for spending this time with us. It was really special, and we appreciate it so much. And Drew, you have been incredible in eliciting all this amazing interaction with Adam, and we're so grateful for you also spending the time with us today. So thank you both so very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we say goodbye. So now it is my honor and pleasure to move on to the next item on our agenda. We are going to hear from Nick Davis, who is a Termeer Fellow, and he's also the president and CEO of Theonis. I think we have Nick online as well, and it really will be a great pleasure to hear from his perspective as an entrepreneur who is delving into the rare cancer space. So, Nick, thank you so much for joining us. Can you hear us?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, can you see me?
Yes, see you and hear you. Thank you so much.
Okay, wonderful. I mean, first of all, I apologize. I had actually planned to be there in person, but I got stuck here in San Francisco because I missed my flight. So hopefully I'm a little bit more efficient at drug discovery than I am at travel here across the country. Anyways, I really appreciate the invite, Anna, Belinda, and Adam. There are two things that you mentioned that really struck home for me. I think the first was mentioning that, some of the original approaches that Henri was advancing in the 1990s were not universally well received. I certainly can sort of commiserate with that feeling. When you're trying to do something new, there certainly is a little bit of incredulousness, right? I think that's very natural. And then I think, Adam, there's something that you mentioned, which was that not every patient is the same. Similarly, not every mechanism for precision medicine for rare cancers is the same. At Theonis, it's really one of the reasons why I started the company, is to leverage new and emerging insights into gene expression and regulation to advance new standards of care for patients, in particular, patients with cancers that are underserved. So let me see if I can share my screen here. I did prepare just a few slides to sort of help as a bit of a guide here. I think you can see my screen, is that right? Okay.
Perfect.
So I want to talk to you today about a new opportunity that we've discovered and we're advancing here at Theonis. Theonis is a company that I started with two of my colleagues, one being Pete Didon at MIT, and then Richard Gregory at Harvard Medical School. What we've done is discover a new therapeutic class that we call precision translational reprogramming. And most of this innovation really features on a new deep understanding of this area of gene regulation known as translation. So translation is really regulated by this molecule or this type of RNA called tRNA. tRNA is really important for binding to mRNA, which I think we all know a little bit about, at least with the COVID vaccines from Moderna and BioNTech. mRNA is obviously very, very important. tRNA has kind of gone under the radar, even though it was one of the first RNA classes to be discovered back when the genetic code was discovered. At Theonis, we're really focused on making sure that we're sort of collapsing all of these primary tiers or pillars for drug discovery in the discovery process, that we are inherently thinking about how we're going to study our medicines in the right patient populations, making sure that we're looking to address mitigated needs and identified needs and well-defined patient populations, and also making sure that when we are designing new medicines, that we're really centering the patient's experience in our discovery process and in our design process. So if you don't mind, I'd like to take a little bit of a refresher here. I know this is a little odd to be going so back to the basics at the Broad, but bear with me. I want to make sure that we're accommodating for as broad an audience as possible. Our medicines really come from a new understanding of how genes are turned into proteins. So Anna, I mean, this may be super remedial for you, but this is the central dogma, right? We have DNA, it gets turned into mRNA or RNA, and then that gets turned into proteins, right? Proteins are the phenotype. It's actually what causes the disease, right? Whether we have too much of one protein, like an oncogene, or too little of another protein, like a tumor suppressor. Well, as it turns out, this is really a lot more complicated than we originally imagined 50, 60 years ago when the central dogma, the genetic code, was originally deciphered. You know, over the past 10, 15 years, precision medicine has really come to a head, right? We started to realize some of the real promise in developing small molecules and other modalities for medicine that go after specific nodes in this regulatory process of gene expression. However, it's important to note that most of our activity in precision medicine has really centered on two polar extremes of this process. We focus a lot on DNA, right? So transcription factors that regulate which DNA elements get opened and expressed and turned into RNA. We focus a lot on proteins. So if you think about kinase inhibitors, these focus on different protein signaling pathways. So you're really trying to control the way that information is passed from protein to regulate oncogenic networks. But there's this huge sort of like white space that really has not been well explored for drug discovery, and that is translation. Translation, which is turning the information in nucleic acids, the information in RNA, into amino acids, or the building blocks of proteins. That's where Theonis is really primed to take a new approach to precision medicine. We are experts in translation, as it turns out, and we've done a lot of study over the past 15 years in deciphering how tRNA and systems of different tRNA molecules are really important for controlling the genetic code, and in particular, in cancer, controlling the expression of specific cancer pathways. So just give you a little bit of background on tRNA. tRNA is this weird molecule that we consider to be one of the key master regulators of the genetic code. It's shaped like the four-leaf clover that you see here on the right, and as it turns out, there are about 300 of them. So, per usual, very, very complicated regulatory biology. However, it's not as complicated as it seems. We've actually been able to develop tools to quantitatively map tRNAs across different tumor types and understand exactly the role that tRNA plays in orchestrating the expression of cancer networks. So typically goes that tRNAs can be regulated by these RNA modifying proteins. tRNAs can be dynamically expressed to drive the translation of specific families of proteins, oncoproteins, based on this three-letter code that's called a codon. Each codon encodes for an amino acid. So basically, tRNAs are choosing which amino acid gets put in which sequence to make full-length proteins. They do this for every single gene in the human genome. So you can imagine tRNAs are really important for functional expression of the human genome. However, with complexity comes many, many different opportunities for dysregulation. And in the context of cancer, dysregulation happens to be the rule, right? So tRNA, or Theonis, is focused on two polar aspects of well-known, well-established tRNA dysregulation that underlies and drives human disease. We're focused mostly on rare diseases across genetically defined diseases where you have a mutation in a specific gene that causes a dysfunction. For example, haploinsufficiency disorders, or in addition, we're also focused on different cancer pathways. As it turns out, tRNAs and these networks of the 300 or some odd different tRNAs actually provide or generate a fingerprint of different tumors, whereby different tRNA expression patterns actually dictate which oncogenic pathways will be expressed, which oncogenic pathways will be expressed as proteins. What we're focused on at Theonis is this mechanism that's known as oncoprotein addiction that drives a lot of the recalcitrance and lack of response that we see in hard to treat, underserved and rare cancers. Put simply, Theonis is tracking a problem. And I don't mean to have people throw tomatoes here, but we believe that people have been thinking about treating cancer in the wrong way for the past 50 years. That's because, as Anna was mentioning at her introduction, just around 5% of cancers are actually caused by heritable mutations. So a single gene and a single oncogene that you can develop a precision medicine against and kind of inactivate that as the primary driver of a disease. Like Adam was mentioning, not all patients are made the same. Not all therapeutic approaches are made the same either. And yet we still kind of treat all patients the same way when you think about either giving them a broadly cytotoxic chemotherapy or generating and delivering a targeted medicine, kind of one small molecule against one protein. Hasn't worked out as well as we may have ideally wanted it to. And so the question arises, how do we actually treat the dysregulation of multiple oncogenic pathways? How do we inhibit entire cancer networks that underlie rare tumors, rare cancers? And if you're looking at the statistics on the slide, about 95% of cancer patients would benefit from approaches that are actually focused on reprogramming pathways instead of single genes, one at a time. It may be surprising here today, but this is a pretty novel way of thinking about oncogenic or cancer therapies, right? We call it precision translational reprogramming. What we've discovered is that the genetic code, DNA, going to mRNA, going to protein, is in fact reprogrammable. And we can reprogram the way that genes are turned into proteins by targeting the enzymes that actually functionally regulate tRNA systems. And what we've discovered is that this is a truly powerful new approach and opportunity for patients who are suffering from rare cancers, some of which have no disease-modifying treatments or alternatives today. Now, when we think about drugging tRNA networks and tRNA systems, in the first instance, Theonis is advancing small molecule therapies that are orally bioavailable. This allows us to reprogram what we call translational regulatory nodes. These are RNA-modifying enzymes that functionally regulate tRNA systems, and by doing so, regulate and control the expression of multiple known, established oncogenic pathways in cancer. What we're looking to do is advance new medicines that hopefully resuscitate the therapeutic responses and improve overall survival for patients who have been diagnosed with certain rare underserved cancers. What this opens the door to doing is actually developing orally bioavailable medicines that improve patient experience and really center the patient's response in our discovery process. In addition, what we've done is actually identify novel diagnostic approaches that allow us to advance our therapies and study them in incredibly well-defined patient populations. This really is the holy grail of precision medicine that we're looking to bring to the clinic. Now, I should mention, Theonis was launched originally a couple of years ago in 2020 We started with an idea at MIT and at Harvard, and we had studied tRNA systems biology across human diseases. We are really some of the experts in tRNA biology, and it's with the support from Bayer, Temasek as well, and then also philanthropic institutions and foundations like the Termeer Foundation and affiliations with Harvard Medical School, MGH, as well as the Broad Institute, that we've been able to advance our therapies into hopefully very soon clinical trials. So I really want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for allowing me to share just a snippet of what we're doing at Theonis today. And I certainly welcome the opportunity to share more in the coming years. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Nick. This was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your work and what keeps you busy these days. And I hope that you can stay with us. We have another patient testimonial, and then we will have an opportunity for question and answer. So I look forward to asking you some questions in just a little bit, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Fantastic, Anna. Thank you.
Awesome. So as you can see, the theme for today is to really dive into science, what's new in rare cancers, but also gain knowledge from the patient perspective, and really the whole day is designed around this. And so now we have a special treat. We have a recorded presentation from Jackie Lewis, who is the founder of the RARE initiative, and she will share with us in her own words about patients solving problems. And so let's roll that.
I'm Catherine Smith, Executive Director of the Termeer Foundation, and I'm honored to speak with Jackie Lewis, Chairwoman of Oddly Travel US and founder of the RARE Initiative. Welcome, Jackie. Thank you for sharing your story as part of our Spotlight on Cancer Rare Disease Day event.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here. Sharing my story is something that's very important to me. I think getting the word out and bringing awareness to what's happening in the rare disease world, and particularly with some of the challenges that we face, is very important. So I'm really honored to be able to speak in front of this audience. Just a little bit about my journey and my diagnosis and how I've worked with MGH over the last couple of years. I was actually diagnosed on March 13th of 2020. So for a cancer called cholangiocarcinoma, I'm doing incredibly well in terms of my longevity and how much I've been able to accomplish in those 2 years, particularly with the help of the Termeer Center. I honestly don't think I'd be here without them today. So after my diagnosis with cholangiocarcinoma, and I had metastases pretty much throughout my body. I have it in my bones, my adrenal, my peritoneal. It's here, there, and everywhere. After that diagnosis, it was pretty tough to hear that I was stage 4. Most patients with cholangiocarcinoma are diagnosed at stage 4. Very, very few things come up that would lead a patient to believe that something is wrong. They might have right side upper quadrant pain or something, which is what happened to me. At the time, I was actually running quite a large company here in Boston called Oddly Travel. So on March 13th, the world basically shut down with COVID. Literally. Italy, I remember I was supposed to leave for Italy the following day with my kids who were on school break, and Italy shut down, and so did the rest of the world follow it, one country at a time. So here I am running a company that's basically been brought to its knees, and I've been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer all on the same day. So it was a pretty rough day for me. So my words to Dr. Goyle, however, I started looking around for the right doctor in the right place to be. And I really just kept going back to the Termeer Center, the work they were doing, and the fact that there was a specialist in cholangiocarcinoma here in Boston at MGH named Dr. Goyle was a blessing, because at that point, obviously, there was no travel allowed to any of the other institutions that might have been able to treat me. So I was incredibly fortunate to be able to have a doctor who worked with the Termeer Center right here in Boston. So having found that out, started to collaborate with Dr. Goyle on what do we do about this, because it's not enough. Like there's not enough happening. This is not right for patients. It's not right for the doctors. And we need to be doing more. The more I started reading about rare disease, the more I realized how underfunded it is, which is incredibly disturbing to me. We get less than 4% of the funding overall, which is just not enough for us to make an impact on anything. 10 years ago, obviously, Belinda Termeer created the Termeer Center, recognizing that rare disease needed more, and that there was more that could be done in terms of the clinical trial world. So taking these specific drugs and making these clinical trials that would have an actual impact on patients and on our ability to diagnose, treat, and hopefully one day cure some of these rare diseases. So that was pretty exciting for me to hear. And again, as an entrepreneur and someone who was tasked with opening a company here in Boston that was going to be quite large and entrepreneurial and through private equity, I think that's probably the background and the backbone that gave me the gumption to say that I need to create something that's going to do better. So I was sitting in my chemo chair talking to my chemo nurse, and she was discussing with me, we were having the debate about how little funding there is for rare disease, and decided to start. I just said, I'm going to raise $1 million for rare disease. And she looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, no, we can do this. It can be done. I think right now we created something called the Rare Initiative. The Rare Initiative basically is a collaboration between my organization and MGH at the Termeer Center. And what we do is raise money, which is right now, as I said, about $770,000, to go after very specific initiatives and lines of work. So what I did notice is that right now, there's like a sprinkle down effect. Like someone gets a grant or donates money and it goes to like 4 or 5 places, but it's never enough to actually make an impact on the work being done. So if you need $1 million for a trial and someone donates 10,000, it's just not going to get us there. So what we decided to do is take some specific initiatives and to work with the Termeer Center to be able to execute on raising funds for those specific initiatives. Working with Dr. Goyle and Dr. Urick has been a pleasure. The entire team at the Termeer Center I can't speak highly enough of. So we've identified specific streams of work that will be funded and have been funded. And if the Termeer Center didn't exist, I'm not sure how we would be able to do that. So, my gratitude literally on one knee goes to the Termeer Center and the staff there for even existing. I've done several clinical trials there, which have extended my life. There's no question about it. And I expect to do several more and to be here for a few more years.
Jackie, thank you so much for talking about your story and about your experiences with the Termeer Center. I know it's a partner of ours at the Termeer Foundation, and we also just know and love Dr. Urick and Dr. Goyle. I'm actually really curious to hear more about the Rare Initiative and what you're thinking that you'd like to achieve with that initiative over time.
Yeah, I think for a lot of what happens is the tumor heterogeneity. So for treatment in general, anything that stops working, which just it goes out to more cancers than you think. Even some of the popular cancers have different types of cancer within them that they just become resistant to treatment. So why is that resistance happening? I think that's a big question, and probably the $1 billion question if someone solves it. Why is that happening within patients? So for me, I was on a trial from May until just recently, but it stopped working. So I had progression. So why does that happen? And then potentially, what are the drugs we can match with the one that we're on that would stop that progression? There's been a lot of work in combining different drugs to be able to make sure that it doesn't work. But we have a long way to go in terms of tumor heterogeneity. And I think the exciting thing about that, if we can crack that, is that, again, it does extend far-reaching to a lot of the rare cancers and subtypes of the popular cancers that are actually rare. So we're really looking at that as, I think, a big target. Dr. Goyle is a specialist in one of the genomic targets that we've identified. So identifying a patient's biomarkers, which is incredibly important at the beginning of the journey. So I've identified the problem that I have is in my IDH1 in my DNA. So that's not performing correctly. So just getting awareness to patients to be able to take that test and those biopsies to be able to identify what is the actual biomarker that they have, which needs to be targeted. So, a big campaign around getting that done and making sure that we are able to target, whether that's targeted therapy, immunotherapy, someone's illness by the fact that they have a specific genomic marker that is, where the breakdown is. And again, as I said, mine is IDH1, which is one of the more popular ones that have been investigated, and FGHFR is one of the ones that Dr. Goyal is incredibly prominent in. She's being published. She is an expert in it. She's made great strides with patients and clinical trials and moving things forward. So we're excited about the work for that. May not help me, but the work that she's doing will certainly be helping other patients. So I'm excited for that to be happening for her. So those are basically the work streams that we're focusing on right now. And we believe that they will have an overall impact on, rare disease, not just one, primary being cholangiocarcinoma for me, obviously, but the work that's being done will impact more rare cancers than just the one that I have, which is cholangiocarcinoma, better known as bile duct cancer.
That's great. I think that both through the RARE initiative and through the MGH Termeer Center, there will just be waves of patients and clinicians who will really benefit from the skill set as an entrepreneur and a businesswoman that you brought to this and your specific lens to your own disease that you've been able to bring to the community. I'm curious if you, just as a final question, if you have any advice that you'd like to give to other people on a similar cancer journey.
Sure. I think the first thing is just to breathe. And then really to find a specialist in the cancer that you have. I can't say how important that is if you have a specific cancer, to get someone who really knows, who can drill down into that, and to get your biomarker testing done is incredibly critical as well. If you don't know what you're going after, I don't know how you can treat it. So starting with those two things is finding the right partner. And again, I truly believe in the Termeer Center. The work that they've done is incredible. But finding the right partner would be my number one thing to say to do, is do your research quickly. There's lots of help out there. There's foundations for most of these cancers. They can point you in the right direction. The Cholangiocarcinoma Foundation is a great resource for people, which can help you identify the proper doctor to work with. And again, you can always look at the clinical trials available for the Termeer Center and contact MGH about the work they're doing and the doctors that they have available too, if it's specifically in cholangiocarcinoma. But finding the right doctor is definitely critical. And then getting your biomarkers tested.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I think the advice that you've given today and sharing your story, we really appreciate participating in today's event. So thank you.
It's been a pleasure and an honor. And again, I really appreciate the work that you are all doing. It's critical for us patients, and it's exciting. It keeps us going strong and motivated. So thank you.
Thank you.
That was remarkable. I know we won't have the chance to ask Jackie questions, but I do think that we have Nick online, if we do still have him online. Yes. Oh, and Adam is here too. That's fantastic. So I think, again, to the theme of today, we're talking about rare cancers, and we're talking about the patient perspective. And I think both Jackie and Adam have really, brought this forward with great courage, I would say, sharing their personal stories. I wanted to start with you, Nick. As an entrepreneur, this is ultimately who you want to serve, right? Patients with rare cancers, people like Adam and Jackie. So as an entrepreneur, as you begin to think about your journey that will ultimately lead to treatments for these patients, what's important for you to know, and what do you need to know from patients in order for your journey to be more successful?
Absolutely. Well, that's a very good question. I think about this all the time. My team and I really center, or at least try to center, the experience of loved ones who have actually suffered through, and some of whom have actually come out successfully on the other side, some of whom unfortunately have not, of their fights against cancer, right? So what's really critical for me to know, and for our team to know, is what aspects of the healthcare system could truly be improved, what aspects of their medical treatment could have been improved. This can dictate or can influence the way that we think about formulating our medicines to make them easier to administer, or the way that we even schedule our diagnostic follow-ups to look at sort of pharmacodynamic monitoring, right, in the clinic. I mean, all of these elements are critical for not only making sure that we can get the therapies to patients, but also making sure that patients can remain compliant.
And can I put you on the spot a little bit, since you operate in the biotechnology space? Do you think people in this space have done a good enough job in terms of meeting the patients at least halfway? And yeah,
You're going to get me killed.
I asked the tough questions.
That's a dangerous, yeah, you do. That's a dangerous question to ask. And
it's an issue about representation, right? We talk a lot about, being able to, learn from our patients, but also how representative is the group of patients that we have access to. So maybe you can comment on all of these different thoughts.
Oh my gosh, wow, okay. I wasn't ready for that one. Let's just say there's a lot that needs to be done to move the needle, right? I'll just say if we were coming out with another kinase inhibitor, the honest path would be a lot easier, okay? If we were coming up with another EGFR inhibitor, just a better way of doing that, it would take a lot less explaining, right? But that's not going to move the needle today for patients. And I think really finding a new way to marry new science and a new understanding of sort of the cutting edge of cancer biology with emerging approaches to measure and sort of define patient populations, and then an increased sort of capability to rationally design therapies for well-defined patient populations and to bring them into the clinic, leveraging fast track, et cetera. That's the Theonis mantra, but that is not the most popular route to getting return on an investment, right? And I think this is one of the exact reasons why Theonis was incredibly diligent with the capital structure for our company. We're working with Bayer and Temasek, two very large investors who are thinking about backing the company all the way into the clinic. I should say that is not always front of mind in the Boston Biotech Investment Committee. Again, Anna, you're going to get me in trouble. But
no, that's wonderful.
I think there are better ways of doing drug discovery, to answer your question directly.
Now, that sounds great. I appreciate your answer. And I want to ask Adam now, from his perspective. You have been around scientists and doctors now for quite a while. And here's Nick, an entrepreneur. He's starting on this journey to bring new treatments for cancer patients. What do you want him to know as he begins?
Yes, what a big question. So Nick, I could listen to you talk. You could give another 30 minutes and I would happily take notes. What exciting work that you're doing, and what just a human at the heart of that, which I can feel. I'm not in Boston biotech landscape. So at least to Adam in the Midwest, I can feel your humanity. I think that, the thing that I want researchers and clinicians to know is that, we need to be as precise with our patient engagement as we are with identifying potential therapeutics for patients. That is, I think when we bring patients in and we have kind of a broad, let's make sure we hear the patient perspective and what do you have to say? Well, all of us struggle to respond to those broad questions, regardless of the environment. What do you want for dinner? Oh, geez, I don't know. But then you narrow it down to, well, what cuisine sounds good? Oh, well, I could go for tacos tonight. So I think it's important for clinicians and researchers to understand the better we can formulate our questions, likely the better responses that we'll get from the patients with whom we engage. So I think that's really important to understand, the setting, right? Are we trying to understand what's going to help us with trial accrual? What's going to help us with identifying what's a tolerated side effect profile? I mean, each of these questions are going to have different responses. So being smart about how we engage our patients and then making sure that we're sort of collecting a representative sample. I think that sometimes we think, oh, well, we're having trouble accruing this patient population. But then we look around at who's on the advisory board, and the folks who we're trying to recruit aren't necessarily the folks who are on the advisory board. So I think being precise about the question formulation with our patients, and then making sure that the representation of the folks that we're asking about, right, that the target population is reflected in the sample population. I think those are important things to keep in mind when engaging with patients. Thanks.
That makes a lot of sense. And actually, I wanted to pick up on something that you just said, and I think that's poignant. You said you're Adam from the Midwest, and I think that's, interesting to note from the perspective that, you don't live in Boston. And, we just heard from Jackie, and she said how lucky she is that her doctor was, basically in the same, town that she lives in. There are many patients out there, I mean, this is true for my own patients and many other rare disease patients, they don't happen to live next to a major academic medical center, right? They might be in, a suburban area, a rural area, somewhere far away from a medical center. So as a patient advocate, what do you think is important in terms of systems that we would have to put in place to serve those patients?
Yes, good. So if Nick was going to get in trouble with his colleagues and peers, then certainly I don't want to get in trouble with folks. Listen, here, I think it's important that especially within rare diseases, and so as someone with a brain tumor, neurosurgery is right, one of the first things that you do. It's the old, slash, poison, burn, right? That approach is still what we do. And neurosurgeons have multiple specialties, right? And so you may not want the person who's done 300 spine cases this year to then do your brain tumor case. So, when we talk about directing patients to academic medical centers, it's not only about the center, right? It's about the folks who are working in those centers to make sure that we're seeking specialized care. I think sometimes there can be a perception that there's a criticism about regional or community health centers, that somehow they're not providing a reasonable level of care, so we have to seek out an academic center. That is sort of the system issue. We would love to stay in a regional or a community setting. I'm just fortunate that Indiana University School of Medicine is very close to where we live, and that's a good center. So I've been able to have most of my care there. That was convenient. But when faced with the question about traveling, I think here's where we can look to maybe a larger sort of multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary. I've used that term now twice, so apparently that's important to me. But as we do have improvements around health information technology, wow, that's a curveball. But thinking about remote patient monitoring, about hospital at home models, about multi-site trials, I think we can do a better job of allowing patients to stay close to home, but scaling up the technology to provide top-notch care, regardless of where the patients are. And I think, the work that's happening with the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, stuff around CMS interoperability, having that in coordination with venture capital, with biotech, so that we can get really sophisticated patient monitoring that's really easy to distribute and administer trial drugs at multi-sites. I think that's the future that we all need to be striving towards. So you don't have to be at an academic medical center. The academic medical center can come to you in the future.
That makes a lot of sense, and I know we're going to hear from Corey Painter later today, her Count Me In initiative, and that's a way to get information from patients in remote areas, but now to actually dispense medicine or care in remote areas as well. I think that's the next level, next challenge, but something that I agree we need to face. It's going to be inherently true for all rare disease patients, no matter what, and so this is something to solve for. My next question to you, Nick, as you are hearing all of these, patient experiences, and you're sort of navigating this early days, I suppose, relatively early days in the biotechnology space. What do you see as the greatest challenges ahead, not just for Theonis or for your particular sort of efforts, but just big picture challenges that you see facing us as we try to bring new therapies for patients?
Well, I kind of harped, and it was for a reason. I hope you'll be able to appreciate. I harped on the small molecule and the orally bioavailable nature of our therapies. There's a lot of talk around new modalities for treating patients with rare disease, gene therapies, right? Obviously, RNA-based therapies. For lack of a better descriptor, or maybe a more politically correct descriptor, biotech has really become a luxury goods business, right? Very, very expensive rocket science that it's going to take a lot of money to develop, where very few patients will realistically be able to benefit from these therapies. When you think about rational drug discovery, it's hard. The first thing investors say to me when I talk about glioblastoma being one of the primary indications where tRNA biology is just like totally known and established, they say, wow, that sounds really hard, right? But there's a reason why we exist. There's a reason why there's sort of a new crop of entrepreneurs that are emerging onto the scene, sort of in the legacy of Henri, right? And the reason is because we have new ways of thinking about making the intractable tractable, right? We have new ways of thinking about how to control the way that genes are expressed and to affect positive outcomes for patients while eliminating some of those adverse events that are just inherent with some of these new-fangled cell and gene therapeutic approaches. I think that's probably the biggest sort of existential crisis that biotech is facing right now. And we're seeing it play out in the markets, as it turns out.
That's very interesting, and those are really good thoughts, and I can see why you were selected as a Termeer Fellow. You have innovative ways of thinking. That's wonderful. Congratulations. Maybe you could just leave us, Nick, with, we heard from Adam about his background, but I noticed that you have an interesting background, initially at Stanford and then here at MIT. So can you speak for a few moments about how your background has influenced how you have developed into the entrepreneur that you are today?
Wow, sure, yeah. So,
there's a lot of young people in the audience and Brodies who want to hear about your journey.
So I was born here in California. I'm here in San Francisco right now. I was visiting my parents, and the reason I missed my flight is because we were kind of running a little bit late for lunch. My parents are very chatty. But I did grow up between London and Madrid. That was really important. Having a sort of, I'll say, non-American centric approach to sort of understanding my identity. And I'll just say, I do have certain interactions that make me uncomfortable in biotech. My experience of sort of being raised elsewhere and then coming to the United States and really being a very nerdy person, I must say, really kind of getting into science from freshman fall, right, at Stanford, being in the basement of the chemistry building mass spectrometers from scratch. That's sort of my pedigree here, right? The nerd in the basement. But what actually allowed me to kind of gain conviction, right, in terms of starting a company was not only the science, right, but also the opportunity to find that marginalization can happen across multiple dimensions of identity, right? Having a rare disease, as it turns out, is a form of identity. It's an axis of identity. Being sort of overlooked by the medical community, that's something that people who look like me can certainly commiserate with, right? It's a long history that has sort of tainted the medical community, at least in the United States and certainly in other areas of the world. When you start thinking about an industry that is now sort of bifurcating into sort of a winner-takes-all approach to treating patients, This is exactly the type of problem that, I've been inspired and I certainly was raised to address. So I think, my message to anyone who would have an interest in exploring entrepreneurship is to ask themselves, why? Why would you want to start a company? And also, what problem are you solving? And the problem, if you ask yourself that question, if you really stare at yourself in the mirror, you might find that the problem that you're solving is multifactorial, right? And it certainly is that case for me. And it certainly is that case for everyone who wants to join, everyone who has supported, and everyone who is advising Be Honest.
Wow, that's incredibly powerful. Thank you for sharing that message, Nick. That's really important. Well, we've heard from Adam, the medical ethicist and philosopher who is now patient and patient advocate extraordinaire. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today, Adam. And thank you, Nick. It's been really inspiring and really thought-provoking. Thank you for sharing all those ideas. And
really appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.
Thanks for having us. And thank you, Adam. Really appreciate you as well. I've listened to your podcast on STAT and been following your work for a long time. And this is just really phenomenal, the work that you've been doing. It has not gone unnoticed by any stretch of the imagination.
Thank you, Nick.
Oh, absolutely
how
not.
generous.
It's an incredibly inspiring story for sure. So thank you both again. And we are going to have some applause, of course. Please do so.
Go on. Thanks.
Thank you
Thanks,
both
everyone.
so much. Please stay on. We are going to move on to the next segment for our afternoon, which is going to be our second to last and really kind of focusing a little bit more on the science. And so we have amazing panelists who I will call up to join me up here. Pick your favorite chair. Mimi Bandopadaye, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Thank you, Mimi. Jean Jurek and Jesse Boehm. And I will sit and join you here for a little fireside chat. You can turn on your mics. Hopefully they all work appropriately. Good. Wow, it's been a great afternoon so far. I think this is, I want to thank you, first of all, for being a part of this and for joining us today to talk about rare cancers, which you know so much more about than I do, but here I am. So I just wanted to give you each a chance to maybe introduce yourselves rather than me kind of going through and really say something about what you think is at the core of your work. You know, what do you really care about in each of your different activities? Let's start there. In any order. Mimi.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks everyone for organizing this. I don't know if Adam is still on, but listening to Adam and Jackie was very humbling, and I think really reflects what we are all about. So I'm a pediatric neuro-oncologist. For those of you who don't know me, you'll hear that my accent is not American, it's Australian. And the reality is that children with cancers touched my heart when I was training to be a pediatrician back in Australia. And as a group with a rare disease and terrible outcomes, you can't meet these families and not be touched. And that changed my course so that here I am 20 years later, shoveling snow in Boston, never on the plan. So I just want to, Adam, thank you. I really do think that working with families, for in my case, children, siblings, parents, cousins, right? It's a rare disease, but it's a paradox where it's rare, but it's devastating, and the loss of one child affects entire communities, and in that, it's a common disease.
That's very interesting. Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective. Jean.
I'm Dan Urich. I'm director of the Termeer Center for Targeted Therapies. I'm a medical oncologist focused on breast cancer, a very common cancer, but it is really rare cancers that keep oncologists like me really on their toes. To see a patient with rare cancer, it's really a special opportunity to engage everything you have and you know, because rare cancers often hide in plain sight. They literally look at times like very common cancer, and you have to have immense curiosity and ask yourself, does this really fit what I'm seeing? Is this truly a triple negative breast cancer? How come these patients having recurrent disease 15 years later from their initial diagnosis? Could this be a very rare cancer called secretory breast carcinoma? So those are some of the questions that I constantly ask myself. And the unifying principle for all the work in the Termeer Center, there are 20 colleagues in our drug development unit, is to treat every patient as truly unique. Almost every cancer, in a way, is rare. The unique constellation of genetic alterations and mechanism that drives them make almost every patient, in a way, rare. I do need to come back to your initial remarks about Ukraine. In 1991, my mother came to our home and says, we have to leave our house. And I was like, why? We have to leave. In 2 hours, all bridges will be closed. And that's it. We're going to be on the wrong side of the line. And that was 1991 when the war started in Croatia and became a refugee and never returned to that home until many, many years later. War is truly devastating, and decisions that we make in these moments can be far-reaching. If it wasn't for the decision of that woman who had 2 small children, I wouldn't be here. So I'm sure there are a lot of refugees now who are being displaced from their homes, and I'm devastated thinking about that because it rings so close to home.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it's a difficult moment. Jesse, hard to follow from that. But
That's certainly hard to follow. So I'm Jesse Bohm. I run a research lab, recently moved from the Broad Institute, now across the street at the Koch, and I'm also the chief science officer of a new foundation called Breakthrough Cancer that's trying to stimulate collaboration. I've always been professionally driven by trying to make collaboration possible. Someone told me recently I'm the most idealistic individual in the spirit of trying to promote collaboration that they had ever met, and I take that as a badge.
I'll vouch for that.
A badge of honor. I will vouch for that also. I think the system needs fundamental change in a number of the ways that the panelists and speakers have spoken about, and it's each of our obligations, myself included, to try to find ways in which, in small, medium, or large ways, we can evoke that change. I think in the case of rare cancers on the research side, I've witnessed over the last 15 years here at the Broad transformative advances that have been applied initially to common cancers, sequencing and CRISPR and drug screening and all of those things. And a number of colleagues and I saw an opportunity to move some of that engine, that discovery engine, towards the rare cancer space that was being underserved. And several years later, I think we're excited about what's been achieved. But for any scientific question, I always ask myself, is the problem structural or is it scientific? And I think especially coming out of this COVID fog, there's an awful lot of the problems that we all face, especially in the rare disease space, that require structural evolution and new structural solutions. And I've always been excited to find new ways to do that.
And so can I push on that? How are you going to change? What structures are you going to put in place? Can
Well,
you tell
I think,
us more?
yeah, looking backwards 5 or 6 years now, taking a page out of Dr. Painter's playbook that we'll hear about quite soon, we saw that while there were 500 or more types of rare cancers, there were many individualized communities all trying to work on their cancer individually. And my background's in functional genomics, growing cells from tumors and trying to find in an empiric fashion all of the ways that you might kill those. We call it a dependency map. Shouldn't there be a Google Maps that you can look up all of the ways of striking down every type of cancer? But there were almost no rare cancers represented in this laboratory map, and everyone was fighting, how do you solve that problem? And so we tried to put the power in the hands of patients in the way that Corey taught me, to try to invite patients across the country to directly donate their living samples to an open source project that was designed to produce laboratory models, cells that grow in dishes, that we could give away freely to the world. And so we tried to invert the system, putting patients at the epicenter and building what's now a collaborative network with almost 20 different foundations and organizations and institutions that are now working much more closely together than they were before. So we haven't solved the problem, but that's an example of, I think, the opportunity in the rare cancer space to work through collaboration. And I'm happy to talk more later on about how we're doing this at Breakthrough Cancer.
That's fantastic. You spoke of collaboration, so maybe I can ask the two of you as well. In each of your different areas, perhaps worth speaking perhaps on behalf of the Termeer Center or maybe more broadly for you, Dan. So, collaboration clearly is important. We know this more broadly sort of in any scientific activity. But what do you see perhaps as a, coming from the legacy of Henry Termeer and how he approached, breaking new ground and, creating something where, there was a lot of, as Belinda said, not a lot of people believed, how do you see it from your perspective now running this Termeer Center at the MGH in terms of collaborations and partnerships? What do you have and what would you like to have moving forward?
The most important partnership is the one with the patient. I think, and I often say this, it's really important and it cannot be sort of emphasized too much. We're not doing science or clinical trials to patients. We really have to always think about the fact that we should be doing it with the patient. So that's the first partnership that is absolutely essential. But to do good science, to do something that really has a chance of making an impact, something that adds teeth to that sacred relationship between me as a physician and a patient, we really need big teams on biotechnology side, on big pharmaceutical company side, on academic institution side. And what is beautiful about Boston is the fact that that ecosystem functions so well. It could be improved, but key elements of that ecosystem and exist, they're hard to replicate. I think fostering this type of relationships is essential, and I hope, and through work of the Termeer Foundation, I hope to see replication of some of these elements and creation of this ecosystem in other parts of the world, hoping to see sort of expansion of this entire model. What is really key in today, when we have access to so much data, that we pay attention to really good data. So by focusing resources on depth of inquiry through that triangle between a physician and a patient and a biotechnology or pharmaceutical partner, to really focus on not low-hanging fruit, but go deep to create mechanisms to keep at it until the answer is there. I strongly believe that we can solve pretty much any problem as long as we do not get distracted and through some near-term performance indicators that we follow, we lose track of that long-term focus and the depth that's needed to actually, yes, cure stage 4 disease. We can cure stage 4 disease.
Excellent.
I think people would call me crazy if I said this 10 years ago when I was just a fellow. But now there are stage 4 cancers that can be cured. And when I see that, that tells me if we keep at it, that we'll have that replicated across many settings, including rare cancers, where this is absolutely, that depth of inquiry is really necessary because you don't have a lot of patients. Every patient is at the same time a person you're trying to help, and it's the only source of information that you have about that disease. And if you do not use that opportunity well, you will not help the patient, you will not be able to learn to help the other patient.
Yeah, that's remarkable. Before I go to Mimi, can I just ask a follow-up question? Is there any particular modality that you're more excited about as we look to the future? I am all for curing stage 4 cancer. Do you think immunotherapy is the answer, small molecules? Nick was telling us small molecules, we should pay more attention to small molecules. What do you think?
I do believe in precision oncology. I think utilizing small molecule inhibitors, now we can do that. Now the chemistries are much better than they used to be. Our understanding of genetic alterations and their networks is much better. And just now we are really starting to make a dent. I've been lucky to be involved with development of a drug against a very common alteration called PIK3CA mutation, which is present about 40% of ER-positive breast cancer. But this whole loop was very interesting. We start with lysosomal storage diseases, a rare disease. Henry and Belinda say, okay, let's now replicate this model where small number of patients treated with very effective treatments can be brought to cancer patients. We started Termeer Center. One of the first targets we go after is the PIK3CA mutation in breast cancer, common disease. But at the same time, as that drug gets to the market, we realize that there is a very rare disease in children called PIK3CA-related overgrowth syndrome, PROS, okay? And it turns out that in that condition that's characterized with overgrowth of various parts of body, skeletal abnormalities, vascular malformation, you have the same mutation. And a very clever physician in France, where the regulatory context is easier to do this, gave the same drug that we are developing for breast cancer in Termeer to these PROS patients. And what do they see? Much dramatic improvement in the condition of these children. So all of a sudden, we're going from rare disease to common disease back to the rare disease. And this loop could be repeated over and over again, where each element in that inquiry and drug development reinforces the other, so that rare disease community does not feel isolated, and that the common diseases are not used just, in the studies of common diseases, not used just to help patients with common diseases.
That's a remarkable insight. That makes good sense. Mimi, Jesse here to my right is responsible for the cancer dependency map, together with all of our colleagues in the cancer program here at the Broad, right? Many others, 1,000 people working together. However, through no fault of their own, maybe they didn't pay as much attention to kids. What do you have to say as a pediatric oncologist, and what are your efforts moving forward to make that better?
Well, they did, because there's a lot of pediatric oncologists saying, what about the kids? And so now there's a pediatric dependency map that is talking to the adults. So I do think there's a lot of progress there. But I want to go back to your question about collaboration, because I think that, before I said, Adam used the word paradox, and I'm going to keep going back to it, right? This field is a paradox. It's devastating, but it's also inspirational in terms of the people that are attracted to this field. We are because we've been touched, either because someone in our family's been sick, or as physicians we've seen that. And so I see it as a privilege. We're working with amazing people in a time where, from the time that we graduated to now, the field, the medical books have been completely rewritten. And so I want to just give you an example of how pediatric brain tumors have gone from, when I graduated, all I knew was that tumors grow in the brain, they had long names, and we treated them as though we were treating adult cancers, and more kids die of that disease still than any other tumor. I'm going to age myself. I graduated in 2001 as the human sequence was being published. 21 years later, we've now learned that not only are they rare diseases, they're super rare because they all have different genetic subtypes. So there's one type of tumor, or one group of tumor, called low-grade gliomas, which, as I said, when I graduated, we treated as adults, as we treat adults, and they're completely different genetically, we now know. And these tumors are rare, but they're also underserved because, fortunately, the kids survive. Unfortunately, they survive with devastating neurological defects. But the funding agencies would say, why should we put resources into this disease, because this child is going to be a survivor? And so in the early 2000s, 3 of our families went to Camp Sunshine. It's a camp up in Maine, an amazing thing for children who have terminal diseases. And these families basically got together and said, this, excuse my French, sucks, right? And so they got together and they started raising funds, they started raising awareness, and they partnered with physicians and scientists to build a low-grade glioma program, which then sequenced the tumors. We understood the genomics. Fortunately, and I think this goes back to your example, fortunately for these kids, the tumors actually involve the MAPK pathway, BRAF, FGFR. And so a decade before this, the melanoma field had developed drugs because it's the same mutations. And so in the span of a decade, this went from we have no understanding of the genetic driver to the first clinical trials in pediatric oncology that are genetically determined. And we are now seeing responses that we'd never seen before. These mutations also occur in higher grade gliomas. And rather than just stabilizing tumors, we've had kids where the tumors have completely responded. These kids would not have been alive if they'd been diagnosed 5 years earlier. And this, to me, is a huge example of how working with patients, not just for the fundraising, but for the advocacy, the awareness, the collection of samples, and the international collaborations between physicians and scientists, right? It's hope. We're seeing that. But the other thing that we're seeing is that even though we have unprecedented starts of responses with targeted treatments, we don't know what we don't know, and there's a lot that we don't know. So we have no idea of the toxicity of these drugs for a developing child. We have no idea how these drugs will impact the natural history of these tumors, and then who else knows what we're going to find in a decade. So one of my favorite parts of my job at the moment, so I have the privilege of leading this program at the Faber, is that every month we get on a telecall with investigators all around the world, right? There are people from Australia logging in the middle of the night, people in Japan, right? International, in your own time, working together to try and share this data, to try and share hypotheses, and labs working together. So, I see this as the collaboration is what makes this job enjoyable, and it's what gives us hope that in a decade from now, we're going to have the even better answers than we do now. So I think it's a privilege to be doing this, and hopefully we will continue to rewrite these medical books.
Yeah, that's remarkable, and that's a really terrific story. It also brings up another point where I would say that at the Broad we have, to some degree, pioneered in that effort, and Jesse, again, has been a part of that. Our director, Todd Golub, has been a huge advocate for this, but the repurposing, right? You gave a story of a remarkable response to repurposing a drug, and I think we have a pretty comprehensive, at this point, effort in drug repurposing here, and these are the kinds of stories across these diseases, but many other rare diseases where, of course, it's very expensive to develop new programs, and those should happen as well for these patients as well as for all other diseases, but there may be opportunities where you don't, where you wouldn't expect them. It's the same story that you shared about the physician scientist in France who had the insight. So I think that there's so much opportunity. I don't know if you want to comment further on the repurposing program.
I turned my microphone on to comment on that because, so another challenge in pediatrics, in addition to rare, is that, okay, it's true, it's cynical, but it's true. Drug companies don't want to spend money to develop drugs for things that affect a few thousand people versus many, right? And so in pediatrics, we've constantly had this challenge of how do you access drugs? And I think the other part of collaboration that has maybe been lacking, but now we're starting to see a lot of excitement, is with the bio industry. And for example, there is one company recently, and I think there's an example of many companies, where a company was intentionally developed to try and take drugs that have been developed by the larger drug companies and deprioritized, but have relevance for pediatrics, and actually specifically take that drug through to the early phase clinical trial. And we've just had the first example of one of these drugs getting FDA breakthrough approval for the phase 2, right? So this is where people are going into biotech with the specific purpose of trying to repurpose some of these drugs and get them hopefully through the licensing for kids with cancers.
Yeah, that's also wonderful. More comments on that, or?
Well, I think what's exciting is in the laboratory, you can be totally systematic about drug repurposing in a way that you simply can't do by randomly randomizing all patients on the planet to all possible drugs. It's just that 5 or 6 years ago, only about 1% of human tumors could be grown in the laboratory, so you could do this type of systematic study. But there's been this enormous revolution with organoid technologies and other ways of coaxing tumors to grow in the lab, so that today, 30%, maybe even 40% of human tumors, including rare cancers for which there had been no models, can now start to be grown, so that these technologies, like what the Golub laboratory established, like what the dependency map team established, now these technologies can be applied towards rare cancers. I'm really excited about the next decade of functional research, functional laboratory research, because I think it'll be rare tumors that hadn't been studied in the past that will be the frontier because of these new opportunities to grow cancers. And I think that's actually recruiting a lot of people back to the field that might have opened their labs in a common cancer because they had 17 cell lines to work with. Now, maybe you don't need a cell line, you can make it yourself. And so people can now follow their passions as opposed to creating a scientific career that's simply one of opportunity based on the resources that are around them.
Yes.
This comment, and now when I meet my patient for the first time, I actually tell them about this. I tell them about the idea of avatars, where perhaps some of the failures we can do in the lab and successes in the lab on material from that particular patient, if we could bring that back into the clinic and shorten the distance between trying something and succeeding in something, that would be absolutely wonderful. But it requires a very open communication, essentially working with the patient so they understand and they stay engaged. It will be now very common for me that my patient, after a treatment fails, she will tell me, Dr. Jurek, did you want to biopsy this? Don't you want to know what happened? I was like, wow, we have already biopsied this disease 3 times. But Dr. Jurek, you told me that the cancer changes and evolves all the time. Shouldn't we check? Maybe there is something. And I was like, okay, let's do this. Obviously, we need a lot of improvements in our techniques and trying to make that experience the best possible for patients. But this situations where the patient is so engaged that they themselves seek truth with you, this is why I go to work, because you just can't replicate that anywhere else.
Yeah, that sounds terrific, and I'm hearing a theme here of sort of new models of collaboration, new ways of thinking about, how to get to answers for all cancers, but especially for rare cancers and especially for kids, from what it sounds like. So, by the way, I want to let the audience know that I get to ask a lot of questions, but you can too. So you can feed them online, or you can actually even ask them live if someone is in the room who has a burning question. So I'm giving you a few minutes to start thinking about your questions while I come back to our panel. And so, the note that we're striking here, I think, is appropriately hopeful. We are kind of in an unprecedented time. We have new tools, we are building new models for collaboration, we are repurposing, we're gaining molecular insights that we never had before. So, I'm gonna ask you now, each of you, what keeps you up at night, though? What do you worry about? What is missing from this future where we have treatments for all cancers and all kids with cancer and even stage 4 cancers? What's missing and what keeps you up at night? Me.
So much keeps me up at night. I don't know what okay, so obviously every time we lose a child, that child, we learn from that child and we carry that with us. One big challenge that we have so I think in many ways pediatrics is ahead of adult oncology, no offense, in terms of collaboration because of our clinical trial structure. We know that our tumors are rare. We know that to show differences in phase 2 and phase 3 studies, they have to be collaborative studies. We have multiple trials consortia that run international trials, right? So in that sense, we're ahead. What we're really behind with, and as a field, and I don't think anyone has a good answer, is that our traditional way of trying to say whether one treatment is better than the other is to test it head-to-head in a clinical trial. Those trials take a decade, right? And so in many ways, what we're learning in the bench side and in the labs is far exceeding our rate of being able to translate that into the clinic. When we get these new targeted inhibitors, how do we integrate that into the standard of care, which right now is cytotoxic chemotherapy? If you don't know if there's a signal, are you going to risk that child by introducing it up front? Right, so we have, I think, trial structure is lagging behind in how do we have a rapidly adaptive, nimble system that you can then employ across all of the sites to actually answer that. So I think that's one challenge. The access to care is a challenge, right? Especially for children with, right? I would want my child to be treated at a center where the oncologists are looking after hundreds of kids and that's all they're doing. But the reality is that that's not the case in America, let alone the rest of the world. And access to drugs, access to trials internationally is something that keeps me up. I get emails from Australia, I'm Australian, and knowing that there's inequity in access to cancer care for children, depending on which city you're born in, is something that as a community we need to struggle with, we need to learn. And then for a child, I'm very excited about targeted inhibition. But then I think about oncology in terms of history. In the 60s and 70s, you couldn't cure a child, right? Dr. Farber showed that you can start combining treatments and you can put a child with leukemia into remission. In the 80s, we had no cures for kids with brain tumors. We started using high-dose radiation and chemotherapy. We got the cure rates up to 70%, 80% in some cancers. But a decade later, we learned that we've devastated these kids neurocognitively. And it keeps me up at night in terms of one of the things that keeps me up right now is we're using targeted inhibitors. We're excited about the responses. We have no idea what the longer term effects will be, even on that tumor itself. And so trying to find ways to proactively learn that in the lab so that we don't have to wait a decade and expose is something that I feel is urgent when I think about this.
Makes good sense. Dan?
There's so many things that keep me up at night. One thing that I personally really worry a lot about is, and I constantly have to self-police myself, is focus. We really need to focus and decide what are the key areas where we can make a dent and then do it. Because every day, every week, one of our patients die. And I feel that in science, we're still often too fragmented. There are these little data lakes exist here and another little lake here. And we need to find ways to just learn from all of that and leverage all of that and much, much more efficiently. It's amazing what we can do when we stop worrying about credits and focus truly on long-term results. Speaking of access, and I think Adam mentioned that, I wish something comes out of this day, a statement or position that actually links to that. Patients with rare cancers should not struggle reaching places like Termeer Center or the Dana-Farber. We shouldn't have patients just here in New York State have to drive across the state line to be able to tune in a Zoom meeting to see Dr. Urich at the Termeer Center. Anywhere in the country, if there's appropriate framework, they should get access to highly specialized care, at least advice. Sometimes that initial nudge, the direction that the patient is started on, is critically important. But so often they simply, even in a country like ours, they are not really able to do that. So finding ways for the COVID pandemic that opened our eyes in terms of virtual medicine, to bring that to rare diseases, rare cancers, it's really essential, because ultimately what bothers me the most, if I have a drug in the Termeer Center that can help someone live a year longer, 2 years longer, and I don't even know about that patient, and they don't know about me. We just live in like two ships in the night, passing each other, not knowing about each other. That's what bothers me, and that should not be happening in 2022.
Yeah, I'll pick up on a couple of the same themes. I think we've witnessed this enormous revolution in sharing data in infectious disease and creating vaccines just in the last few years that shows when there's tremendous urgency and there's a shared will and a sense of the need for mass action, just unbelievable things can happen like instantly that were never before possible. And I'm most worried that the oncology community won't fully come away with this moment having learned that lesson. Because I think the cancer community is ready. If you talk to people, especially young people, the cancer community is ready for that type of radical collaboration, whatever that means to the individual, to put down their weapons, no pun, pipettes and keyboards and whatever, and actually work together in the same ways that they saw their infectious disease colleagues do, and just not be bothered by who gets the credit. And I guess I'm most worried that we'll forget and we'll pivot back. We're too plastic, we'll pivot back. And that the latent incentives that are in the system that have been there for so long will continue to draw us away from our true passions, which is to solve problems, cure patients, and go to bed at night and at the end of our careers feeling like we did something important for humanity. But I do think I'm optimistic because I think the cancer community is ready. We just all have to figure out in our own ways how to not miss this moment. 2 years from now, it's going to be too late. This COVID moment, as horrible as it is, gives us, especially in the rare cancer community, this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and I just fear we'll let it slip by.
I agree with you, and I think that that can be generalized to all rare disease to a large extent. And I like the hashtag, change missiles for medicines.
Put down your pipettes
that's
and
a good
pipette
one.
together or something.
I think that's a good one. I would like to open it up to anyone who may have a question. Todd has a question. It's an honor to have you here, Todd.
Did you turn this on?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, anytime we want to bring a new medicine to patients to the clinic, we're trying to balance the potential benefit that they might have, hopefully informed by science, and the potential harm that might be done through toxicity and so on. So the question is, with respect to rare disease, is that balance, should we think about that balance any differently than common disease? And do you think we have the balance right? Because, it's not uncommon for families to say, with a family member who's dying of a horrible disease, a horrible cancer, why are you trying to protect my child, let's say, from, some unknown toxicity? Shouldn't we be doing this experiment in people now? Why don't you feel more urgency?
Yes, Mimi.
Yeah.
Jump right in.
And then isn't it ironic that Dr. Fabre tested his regimes in children, right, to start with, right? So, yeah, I totally agree with you. I think one of the we have a lot of devastating cancers, but there's a subtype that you know about, diffuse intrinsic pontine gliomas, right? These are tumors that grow in the brainstem. We have nothing that is curative. We treat the kids with radiation. It's palliative at best. Most children die within 9 months of diagnosis, right? I look at a scan, your heart sinks. The first meeting, you're telling these families there is nothing that we can do, right? So if all diseases, right, this would be a rare disease, that why don't you put everything that you can in to try and prolong survival? And I agree with you, I think we should. But regulatory systems, IRB systems challenge that, right? So the most nimble system in my mind would be a biopsy. You find a drug, a mutation that you think you can target, and I don't care if this drug hasn't been in clinic. If the family understand the risks, the benefits and risks, why not try it? It is harder to do that because of regulatory IRBs and things that are associated with the trials.
Any more thoughts?
No, we don't. No, we haven't, we don't have this balance right at all. As an oncologist, we constantly operate between these two curves. On one side, you have the efficacy curve and the other toxicity curve, and we try to widen this therapeutic window as much as possible. But sometimes we worry a lot more about toxicities than we should. It was the Farber mantra, fear the disease, don't fear the treatment. What that means is that ultimately the biggest threat to the patient is often that rare cancer that has no other treatment options. But we have to be thoughtful and we have to be careful to always keep an eye on that other curve, the toxicity curve. But sometimes, unfortunately, there's so much fear and anxiety, particularly with new treatments, repurposed treatments, and unfortunately, only about 3% of patients with cancers participate in clinical trials with these new drugs. I don't fully understand all the reasons for it, but in part, it's that fear of unknown, fear of toxicities, which I think with modern technology capabilities that we have, we could mitigate and we could be a little bit more bold in application some of these tools. That's certainly happening right now with CAR T cells, which are sometimes extremely toxic treatments. But what changes the calculation is the remarkable efficacy that sometimes comes with it. So as long as we pay attention to both sides of both of those curves, maybe we'll be able to strike the balance. But right now, we are far from it, actually.
Do you think we have a role as physician scientists in advocating to the regulatory agencies for these types of things? Patients have certainly asked for access, increased access, right? So how do we strike the right balance?
Yeah, I think we're still doing clinical trials the same way we did them in the 80s or 90s when we studied very toxic drugs. I don't know if you guys knew, but the way we developed cancer drugs back then is if you were working in a pharmaceutical company, they would tell you if you go on a vacation, bring a little bit of soil. And they were isolating these very complex molecules out of that soil. Adriamycin came from Adriatic Sea coast. Now we have computer-based, AI-based design. We understand how molecules vibrate on the surface and how interaction of those molecules open up a pocket for the drug. Now we have much better approaches to actually do the work before it hits patients, but still, when we deploy these drugs in the clinical setting, we're still using sort of these really old school approaches, extensive monitoring, making intensity of these trials so difficult and very challenging for patients. I think with some variables, virtual medicine, select monitoring, really things that matter, that we understand for toxicity studies in the preclinical setting, that we should do much better. I think if we can, I'm blaming kind of our own community why patients don't participate in trials, and we have to make a difference there, and perhaps patients will then jump on board there as well.
Yeah. I think we're too paternalistic. I think we should let patients, and maternalistic, we should let patients decide. I've had this conversation with many oncologists. I say, well, based on this data, this Western blot, this kind of laboratory experiment, would you prescribe that thing to your patients? And they said, absolutely not. That's way too risky. And then you follow up with, well, if it was you or your wife or your child, would you do that? And they say, oh yeah, absolutely. And so I think the risk tolerance in terms of how we think about other people's cancer experience versus our own when it really comes down to us, I think reveals some fundamental disconnects about how we assess risk. And as long as there's sufficient transparency and information and education and awareness, as you heard from Adam before, probably Adam knows more about glioblastoma than 90% of card-carrying oncologists, and so I would trust him to make decisions based on his treatment any day of the week.
We have to be thoughtful, and I think we have to follow scientific method. There are ways how to design our experiments. At the end of the day, if we do things well, there are no failed studies. Sometimes, though, if we do things ad hoc, chasing these short-term endpoints, as I already mentioned, sometimes we get in a really challenging territory. But if we do science well, engage the patient, and weave both standard of care options, investigational approaches to constantly keep options open for patients, we can learn a lot.
The last word is yours, Mimi.
Yeah, I wanted to agree with that. I think we need to get away from the old multi-institute phase 3 studies that take a decade and have more nimble trials that will introduce these earlier. But just going back to your question of can patients help collaborate, I think, again, pediatrics is a model where they have. So one of the other big challenges we've had in pediatrics is not only is the question, can you use a drug for the first time? Can you use it for the first time in a child if it hasn't been in adults, right? And that has been a major issue because you then have to wait for the adult studies to finish. And so, again, driven by patient advocacy. So that's one part of it. And the other part is the financial incentive, right, for a drug company. So over the last decades, our families have been amazing in advocating to the federal government, who've introduced incentives for drug companies, not just incentives, but actually almost mandated, right? If you don't, you get to, when you're developing a drug, you have to show that you're also thinking about the development in pediatrics. And so I think that is an example of patient advocacy in trying to change structures that have been around for decades that are outdated now.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's generally true for rare disease because a lot of it affects children, as it turns out. And so thinking about new models and becoming creative about, and then for those of us on the discovery side, becoming advocates all the way through, not just for the discovery of something, but also to make sure that it actually gains access to the right people, I think is an important message. So Mimi, Dan, and Jesse, thank you so much. This was an incredible session, and we learned so much. Hopefully our audience enjoyed learning more about your work. I am personally grateful to you for your time and participating in this. And we are now moving on to the clap. Thank you. I'm sure there's roars clapping online, but we can't hear it. But now for our last, but certainly not least, we have my good friend and colleague, Corey Painter, who's going to tell us about her Count Me In initiative. And you need no further introductions, Corey. I know you will take us through your story. And thank you so much for being with us today. It's such a thrill to be here. And I'm going to speak. I need to give you my mic. Oh, you need a mic. So here you go.
Oh, got it. Awesome. Thank you. I really can't not express the gratitude I have to be here today. Thank you. And I also don't think that I could have ever picked a group of people that I was more aligned with than every person that has talked here today. It was very evident when Adam was speaking that I could relate to every single thing he said, and it'll become evident as I give my talk why that is. And then I heard Jackie speak, and I felt the same. And then I heard the panel speak from the scientific perspective, and I felt the same. And it's just across the board so important for us to have moments like this where we can come together unified in our desire to champion rare diseases and rare cancers, because there are these themes that emerge. And when you see those themes emerge, there's an opportunity to take advantage and leverage them for the betterment of everybody that could be touched by something so rare and so awful as what we're going to talk about next. So I'm Corey Painter. I'm the deputy director of an initiative called Count Me In that we launched out of the Broad. I'm going to go into some details, but before I go into what Count Me In is, I'm going to talk a bit about my personal story. And I'm going to start with this picture. And I think we all have a sense from all the pictures in the gallery and from the pictures that have been part of this initiative for years since it was started, the power of a picture and what it says. I had a Boston Herald photographer follow my husband and I for the first year after I was diagnosed with this very rare endothelial cell cancer called angiosarcoma. This is a cancer that starts in the inner lining of your blood vessel. If you think of the blood vessel as a hose, it's like the very inner lining of it. So it can really pop up anywhere in your body that you have a blood vessel, which is most places. And mine popped up in my breast. And more on this with you as we go through this talk, because there's a PIK3CA reveal that will come later in this talk. But suffice it to say, they didn't know what this was, and it was some really weird tumor in my breast that took a crazy diagnostic odyssey to figure out. This odyssey involved 11 core needle biopsies over the course of 3 different appointments, a fine needle aspiration, a full surgery, sonograms, mammograms, MRIs, PET CTs, CT scans, before they could tell me what this thing was. And through the course of that journey, I was told, you're either fine or you're something else that starts with an F. I'm not going to say it here in this fine audience, but it was truly awful. And none of us thought I was going to make it when it turned out to be the latter. So my oncologist told me they had never treated a case of this, but somebody before him had when I was treated in a community setting, and they said, go to Dana-Farber. And I went to Dana-Farber, and I love my team. And I will give another reveal. My team is now my scientific collaborators. We've co-published. We've written grants together. It's really cool. It's also pretty surreal. But suffice it to say that in their collective history, they had only treated about 10 cases of my type of cancer in the best of the best places to get cancer. So this is my husband and I trying to make it through a scan, right? And you can't tell which one of us is the cancer patient here because he shaved his head in solidarity for me. When I was diagnosed, the first thing I did, I was a scientist at the time, I was just about to get my PhD in biochemistry and biophysics. Again, we're going to talk about that when we get to the PIK3CA reveal later. But I was, well-versed in how you understand the literature. And I went, and it was just devastating. The best paper I found was about a long-term survivor with angiosarcoma who lived an entire 12 months. And I was like, oh, God, dagger in the heart. And so I was like, there's no basic research. The best that they could do were these case studies and these natural history, the histories that would be collated over the course of 40 years at any institution where they could pull like 12 patients and try to do some ridiculous statistical analysis of the, stratifying these patients based on God knows what, but it didn't actually make sense to do if you know anything about statistics. And so there was no basic research. And when you're a scientist, that's devastating. It's the whole thing is awful, but that is just that opens up an existential crisis like nothing else. And it actually lit a fire under me that I'll talk about in the next slide to try to do something about it. And it's not easy to try to find that path, but there is always one there. There's always the best way forward, no matter how awful. When I couldn't find anything in the literature, I went to Google and I was like, I just need to find somebody else that's gone through this. I just need to talk to another human who understands. And I looked for people, and they were there. There was a couple people, and I reached out to them, and they didn't answer. And then I put their name in, and I put the word obituary, and they popped up every time. I was too late. We were like passing ships. So in an unlikely place to find anything relevant for science, I went to Facebook, and I typed in angiosarcoma cancer, and lo and behold, there were 10 people there. And to one of the points that Adam made at the beginning, this was just a cross-section of humanity who had really bad luck, just like me. There were stay-at-home mothers. There was a cop. There's a Disney Imagineer who designs the roller coasters that we all like to play on. And we are all sitting there with this crazy diagnosis trying to figure it out together. And they knew more than the collective literature and all of my doctors combined. Again, we're not going to sit there and design experiments together, but they knew every single person who had ever surfaced as a quasi-expert. They knew how to get there. They knew how to travel there. They knew what shirt I should wear after my surgery. They just helped with all of the practical aspects of going through this, and it was just remarkable. And it was through this that I met this woman who, again, stay-at-home mom, but she had this vision that she was gonna found a nonprofit, and she was going to raise $1,000 and give it to the American Cancer Society, and they would cure it. And I just kind of broke her heart a little bit when I told her that's noble, but that's not going to move the needle. And she looked at me. She's like, "Well, what is?" And I'll tell you what is, really thinking critically about what is, how do you pursue impact when you're just slammed by something like this? This is what occurred to me. It's like, how do you make a true and lasting impact when you only have months to live? And you have a cancer that nobody's going to fund nobody's going to study, and nobody's going to champion. And those are three distinct things that you need to come to bear on any kind of research question that you might be wanting to address. So this is the road that I took. But I want anybody that's listening to this to envision a totally different path, because there's a million that have been taken and they've been equally as impactful. And it's by sharing what worked for each of us that I think we're gonna get to kind of the next step. So this is what I did. I started a nonprofit with my friend Lauren, the stay-at-home mom. She did the business, I did the science, and we just looked for investigators at the periphery of my cancer. We all know here in this room that there are no people that are banking their entire career on studying angiosarcoma, but it's a vascular cancer, so there are vascular biologists. And it's a sarcoma, and there are sarcoma doctors, right? And the most surprising thing that there is in this world are veterinarians that treat a whole lot of hemangiosarcomas, which are the same type of cancer, just named differently, in dogs. And so if I could raise money, I could stitch them together and be like, hey, vascular biologist, did you know this veterinarian over here really could benefit from your knowledge, and pull them together. And so that's what I did. I would just pull people together. I made a funding mechanism that required them to open source any information or models or whatever. And they would have to give me a little bit of an advance notice midway through to get the second pot of money. So it was just a desire to just do something and then have it shared out. That was the first thing. And then the second thing, which is why I'm here, is that obviously my career goals went down the drain, right? Like I was a biochemist, I had just written a grant to do a postdoc and studying ALS because I watched my friend die of that, which is just as awful, also rare. And so that was gonna be my career path. And obviously it went away because I didn't think I was gonna be alive in 6 months. I was like, what can I do? And so I tossed away everything and just kind of looked for any opportunity that I could to not impinge on my cancer, because that's not going to work for all the reasons I already stated. My thought was that we have to fundamentally change systems of how we collect data and how we distribute it and how we incentivize it. And I'm racking my brain, how do we do this? How do we do this? And at the same time, the Broad Institute was looking for somebody to do that in metastatic breast cancer. They wanted somebody who understood the perspective of a patient and who understood the advocacy landscape and that understood data to come and build this new initiative where you could engage directly with patients in order to basically liberate data, both from them, from their voice, from their clinical medical records, from their tumor samples that were just sitting on a shelf, like mine in Western Mass, not doing anything to provide answers to our understanding of their disease. And so I came. And I helped them build this, and I helped them try to overcome this major challenge, which is that 85% of U.S. cancer patients are treated in the community setting, just like me. And so our tumor samples aren't ready. They're not available for research. The vast majority of them are not available for research. But we live in an era where we're all interconnected. I'm not the only person in the world that found my people in Facebook. I think actually if you're slammed by a diagnosis, rare or common, you find your people online. You have people that you meet with in person, but I promise you, every single person, if they're not online, if Aunt Sally is 80 years old, she's probably not online. But guess what? Aunt Sally's nephew is absolutely married to somebody who's a social media maven and is getting information for Aunt Sally all day and all night long. So somehow, somewhere, there's somebody in that person's network that's interconnected with other people in other disease communities. And maybe we can leverage all of these connections in order to come to bear on really important questions that were kicking around. I think that started from Todd Golub, that went something like this. What if we were able to generate a massive publicly available database that had clinical information and molecular information and the patient experience in order to accelerate discoveries and impact clinical care? So when I came, I worked with Nick Wagley and the rest of the leadership of the Broad in order to build this project in metastatic breast cancer. We built the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project, and every single one of you, if you want to follow along or just check out this website, you can take your phones out. This is the one talk where that's okay, and put mbcproject.org and take a look at it for yourself. This was a website, and the reason I'm letting it linger here is for everybody to have a good look at it. This is a breast cancer study, but there's no pink, right? There's no hyperbole. There's no talk about cure. There's just language that has been built in lockstep with patients who have this disease, who just had enough with, scientists claiming all of these lofty goals that they never actually were able to deliver on. They just wanted to work with us in order to make a difference in the lives of people to come that were going to be slammed by their cancer. And so it's to help understand metastatic breast cancer. It's not to cure it, right? So every single part of the website, every message, the consent form was redlined in lockstep with about a dozen metastatic breast cancer patients who, many of them have passed away and some are still alive and still very close to us, to the project, and to me personally. And, this graphic didn't come out very well, but this is a look. We launched this in 2015, and over 6,000 people, men and women, because men get this disease too, were signed up since then. And you can see the picture on the left is supposed to be the United States. You can sort of make it out without the outlines, which is kind of a testament to just how many people have joined the project. This is where they're from. And they're from some of the major academic institutions, but the vast majority are from single institutions all throughout the community. And so you can see here, this is a really cool graph that Isha Jane put together. And you can see in yellow, these are, the size of these bubbles are kind of reflective of the number of patients that are represented by that. Those yellow circles are NCI designated centers, Dana-Farber's and your MD Anderson's and your MSK's. But these little tiny blue ones that are the bulk of the people who have signed up are individual centers scattered throughout the country and Canada. There are over 1,700 institutions where one patient has signed up and driven our research forward as a result. This is a look at the data, and this is Beth, who helped drive our discovery work right here. She's a member of the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project. And what we have done is generated de-identified, clinically annotated whole exome sequencing and RNA-seq from about 400 tumor normal matched samples. But we've also collected the medical records of over 3,000 patients, and we've also collected blood biopsies from over 1,000 of these patients, and we've also collected patient reported surveys from these same patients. And we're able to just open source it. Right here you can, hold on. You can see on CBioPortal, you can just go and download it for free. Anybody, you can go on your phone now and you can go to CBioPortal and you can take a look at all of the data. There's this really great button right here, which is more charts. And it's like, more charts, please. There's so much clinical data. This is the thing that's so beautiful about this, is just like the depth of the clinical data that's associated with this is deep and it's rich. And so I implore anybody who wants to take a look at it to go onto CBioPortal and check it out. We also have an interactive patient browser that's right on the website where you can filter through and say, hey, how many people between 35 and 40 that have HER2-positive metastatic breast cancer are part of this, and pull them out. And then we share it on CBioPortal, the GDC, and on our website. The question then was, can we do this in other cancers? And why not mine, right? Why not? If we've built this right, maybe we could actually do this in my cancer. And this is just a Kaplan-Meier curve showing what this looks like. And it's terrible and very deadly. And when I was standing up here looking down, it was so steep, I would get vertigo just looking at this picture. So we went ahead and we pointed the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project to my Facebook group and said, what do you think? And they said, we want it yellow, we want the same words, we want more people, go. And so we did, and we were able to build the angiosarcoma project and launch that in 2017. And to date, over 500 people have joined that study. But when we first, which is crazy, right? It's like the lion's share of people who get this disease. And so social media and rare is absolutely a good thing to put on the radar for any of you who are interested. So I'm showing one piece of data from the early sequencing that we did, and I'm showing it because I don't think anybody in this room needs an explanation that this is not a normal distribution, right? There's a group of people. When you look at the mutation inside of the DNA of angiosarcoma tumors, a group of people have really high TMB. And this corresponds oftentimes with people who have good responses to checkpoint inhibitors. So we took a deeper look at who these people were, and it turns out that all but one had their angiosarcomas sun-exposed, arise in the sun-exposed regions of above the clavicle. And when we actually looked at the DNA inside their tumors, they had a UV signature. And so they had all the hallmarks of basically having a melanoma, but inside of an endothelial cell. So we then went, because we had the medical records from all of the people in the cohort, and we looked to see, had any of the doctors in the community setting ever tried immunotherapies on their patients? And if so, did they work? We found 6 patients, 3 just internal, non-high TMB mutated cancer, angiosarcomas were tried, and none of them had a response. 3 had a metastatic angiosarcoma in sun-exposed areas with high TMB. 1 had an immediate response, adverse reaction, had to be taken off. 2 of them had this exact same situation. All right, this is their clinical history right here, where they were on something, it didn't work, on something else, didn't work, on something else, didn't work. They went on pembrolizumab, and they had a complete and durable response. Both patients actually had an adverse reaction after a considerable amount of time and were taken off. And both, this should be updated because we check frequently, are still without evidence of disease on no therapy. If you look in the medical record of one of them, it says, this is like somebody in the middle of Arizona. It says this in this person's medical record. After the first cycle of pembrolizumab, he has had a dramatic reduction in the size and mass in his neck and the retrooral area. This is just amazing. How many medical records have a line like that we just don't know about, right? So I was shopping this data around the second we found it, and the sarcoma community of clinicians are small and tight. There's like 200 in the world, and they saw this data, and they immediately started writing clinical trials. So they wrote 3 clinical trials just based off the data well in advance of our publication. And we ended up writing this up in Nature Medicine, and it was this discovery plus one I'm not showing that I don't have time to go into, but suffice it to say, breast angiosarcoma patients have PIK3C mutations. I'm a biochemist. I modeled them onto the 3D structure, and they all surround the canonical breast cancer mutation. So we should talk. That was my big reveal. But we went ahead and published in Nature Medicine. And the data was used in a DART basket trial, which was published the same year and confirmed what we were finding. And so this has changed the standard of care for cutaneous patients with angiosarcoma. So all of this led to us enabling the opening up of our platform to everybody who's ever been diagnosed with cancer in the United States and Canada. And my next steps, now that this is open to everybody, is to try to identify between 5 and 10 rare cancers where a Count Me In approach could be transformative, meaning that it has to have a low incidence, it has to have a clear unmet need, both clinical and also molecular. If there's no way that we can actually address things molecularly, we need to find where we can have impact. There has to be outreach potential, right? We have to be able, it doesn't necessarily have to be Facebook, it could be a network of physicians. We just need to be able to reach patients. And we don't want to be competitive with other similar efforts in the space. And so my mind is open if anybody has ideas and would like to talk to me about it. And with that, I just want to say thank you. So this is our team. These are some patients displaying their saliva kits. And I always want to close with this one beautiful statement from a woman who's since passed away. I want to live and watch my children grow up, but if I can't, I want to leave a legacy and a cure. Thank you.
Corey, this is phenomenal as always. I will ask if there's a burning question in the audience, or otherwise, I will ask my question. So it kind of builds on what we were talking about earlier. You have clearly demonstrated that this works, and it works beautifully, and there's more data that can come in from learning from patients and doctors in the community. So now the question is exactly what I was saying earlier. Can we also reverse it so that we can actually dispense discoveries that are made in the Boston ecosystem to that patient in Arizona, for example? So do you have thoughts on that? And
I do.
Yes.
So I do. I think we're in a moment of time. I was actually chatting with Mimi earlier about the hope that came with COVID. One of the silver linings that came with COVID was the ability of doctors to treat across state lines. right? And for rare diseases and rare cancers, that was transformative, absolutely transformative. I cannot tell you how many people I know were able to go see that doctor and actually, get advice and then have their local team treat them. Whereas before, I know people who bankrupted themselves just to get the shot, right? Just to get a shot at living a little bit longer, and they didn't live, and their families were just totally devastated financially. And so, the big unfortunate thing that I would love for this community to try to help solve for is that it's kind of reverting. Now that we're not in a state of emergency, it's reverting. And so, doctors are once again kind of limited in where they're able to treat their patients, which is just, it impacts the rare cancer and rare disease community so much more than any of the others. And so, just as a testament to how big of an issue this is, I run a nonprofit, that nonprofit I talked about, right? I've spent years and years and years funding research. Probably put $1 million into a bunch of different labs that I talked about. And where I'm at right now is I just gave a $50,000 grant to Memorial Sloan Kettering to fly people to a clinical trial, because we can make all the discoveries we want. And we can make them through the work I'm doing, but if you cannot connect a patient to that drug, then what's the point? The doctors, they get disheartened, they stop writing the trials. The patients, they don't know how to even find the trials, and if they can find them, they can't afford to get to them. And so in this space, there are several things that we could do. We can, put serious bank into flying patients where the trials are as a Band-Aid, because that is not the solution. But it's something we can do today in order to try and get people to live and show that if you would make investments into clinical trials that are focus on rare patients, that you can both accrue and that they work. That's like a thing we need to do. But then separately, we really need to look into to these repurposing trials, to basket trials, to the ability to do decentralized trials. And there's all kinds of people. Craig Lipset is a big champion in this space. I would encourage everybody to go and try to do some more research there.
Corey, thank you. I think we're getting the cue that the hour is late. Thank you so much again for an amazing talk. It has been an amazing afternoon, and I think we all learned a lot. We also saw where the holes in the system are and where the opportunities are for advocacy, for improvements on many levels, as Corey has taught us and all our other speakers. And I think we've learned a lot from patients. And on that theme, I just wanted to encourage everyone as you leave, for those who are here, and for those who are at home, if you ever want to come and visit the Broad, we will have them in the lobby, but the Beyond the Diagnosis exhibit is outside, and there are really some inspiring portraits of kids with rare diseases, and I think you will really enjoy looking at them. So I think it's been a remarkable afternoon. We've learned a lot. There are some thanks to give. Jillian Shaw, Dr. Shaw is my trusted scientific advisor, and she's really been an accomplice in putting all of this together. Together with Katie Liguori and Rachel Buckley, who's still out there making sure that everything is well organized. So thank you all very, very much for your help with this. I want to also thank our colleagues at the Termeer Foundation, Catherine Smith, who's here, the Executive Director, Paul Kidwell, and of course, above all, my co-host, Belinda Termeer. It's been wonderful to have this partnership this year, and I think we've learned from each other and how synergistic our efforts might be moving forward. I wanted to end with getting myself in trouble with a provocative idea. I would like to say that I think what we're learning today, and we focused on spotlighting cancers today, but I think as we think about all rare diseases, I would like us to think that maybe we can cure all rare diseases in our lifetime. Maybe that's actually doable. Maybe we have the tools and the know-how. Maybe we can get there if only we can organize ourselves and find the resources and the organizational structure to do that. So I know it's a lofty goal. I'm open to criticisms, suggestions, comments on how we can make this happen. But I think on behalf of all colleagues here at the Broad, I think that this is kind of a wonderful goal to have. Curing all rare diseases in our lifetime would really be a tremendous legacy to leave for the next generation. I want to thank you again for your attendance today and for your comments and ideas, to all of our speakers especially. And I hope that you will enjoy your evening. Thank you so much.